Hey there, sleepy travellers. Tonight we're cracking open Greek mythology, gods behaving badly, heroes punching lions, and a wooden horse that ended an entire war. It's history's wildest family drama, and it all kicks off in total darkness before the sun even existed. We'll travel from the silent void of chaos to the rise of Zeus, then follow Heracles through his impossible labours, watch Troy burn over a stolen queen, and sail home with Odysseus through every monster the sea could throw at him. Smash that like button if old myths are your vibe, and drop a comment telling me what city you're tuning in from tonight. Dim the lights, get cozy, let's begin. Long, long before stars hung in the sky, before oceans had a coastline to crash against, before anyone in the universe had figured out the concept of breakfast, there was nothing at all. The Greeks called this state chaos, though that word has gotten a bit of a public relations problem over the centuries. Today when we say chaos, we picture traffic jams, screaming toddlers, or the kitchen on the night before a dinner party. The ancient version was much quieter. Chaos to the Greeks meant a yawning emptiness, a vast unsorted gap where the rules of up and down had not yet been written. Imagine a room with no walls, no floor, no ceiling, and no light, to show you that any of those things are missing. That was the universe at hour zero. Out of this silent gap, the very first beings began to emerge, and they did not have personalities so much as job descriptions. Gaia rose first, the broad and steady earth, with shoulders wide enough to carry every mountain that would ever exist. Then came Tartarus, the deep pit beneath the earth, dark as the inside of a closed eye and twice as cold. Erebus arrived next, the shadow that lives between things, the kind of darkness that hides under stairs and behind doors. And finally Eros, often imagined later as a giggling baby with arrows, but in this earliest version simply the force that draws things toward each other. Gravity with intentions, you might say. A few quieter siblings emerged alongside them. Nyx, the soft black hush of night, with a face no one quite remembered after seeing it. Hemera, the steady warmth of day. Ether, the bright upper air where eagles would one day learn to drift. These were not gods in the way we usually think of them. They did not wear robes or throw lightning. They were more like the bones of reality itself, the structural beams holding existence up so that everyone else would have something to stand on. And because Eros was now stirring through this newborn cosmos, things began to seek each other out and combine. Gaia, with no one to ask, produced a partner of her own. She made Uranus, the starry sky, who arched himself above her like a great spangled tent. Together they covered the world top to bottom, and from their meeting came the first true family of the cosmos. Their earliest children were the Titans, 12 of them, enormous beings who walked the young earth before mountains had decided where to stand. There was Oceanus, who flowed like a great river around the rim of the world. There was Hyperion, who lit the way for what would later become the sun. There were Tethys, Theia, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe and Rhea, each with a domain or a quality woven into them. Themis held justice. Mnemosyne held memory, which seems like a small portfolio until you imagine what the world would be without her. Phoebe carried the bright glow of prophecy, and then came the four brothers, Creus, Caius, Iapetus, and youngest of all Cronus, who would be the one to remember. But Uranus and Gaia did not stop at 12 respectable children. They went on to produce something a little stranger. 3 Cyclopes came next, each one with a single round eye in the middle of their forehead, the kind of feature that does not exactly invite a hug. Then came the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers each with 50 heads and 100 arms apiece, being so unsettling to look at that even their own father could not quite manage it. To be fair to Uranus, parenting a child with 300 elbows between them was probably not in any guidebook he had been handed. This is where the trouble starts. Uranus, taking a long look at his 100-armed offspring, decided he simply could not bear to share the sky with them. So he did what no decent parent should ever do. He shoved them back down into the depths of their mother, into a corner of the world so dark and cramped that even light forgot the way in. Gaia, the earth itself, was forced to carry these enormous children inside her like a swallowed sob, and the pressure of them gave her a pain that mountains were not built to hold. Naturally, this made her furious. She fashioned a great curved blade out of grey stone, the very first sickle in the universe, and not exactly an item you would want sitting in the kitchen drawer. She called her children together, the older Titans, and she asked which of them would help her end Uranus's tyranny. The Titans, perhaps sensibly, looked at the floor. Only the youngest, Cronus, raised his hand. He took the sickle from his mother's grip and waited for nightfall. What followed is best summarized as a family confrontation that the family never quite recovered from. Cronus used the sickle to overthrow his father, ending Uranus's reign as ruler of the cosmos in a single sudden stroke. The wounded sky retreated upward, far higher than before, putting a respectful distance between himself and the earth that has held ever since. Out of his fallen strength rose fresh beings, because in those days nothing was ever truly wasted. The Furies were born, fierce-winged sisters who would later chase down anyone guilty of crimes against family. Giants rose up from the same drops, armoured and hungry, and from a foam upon the sea, drifting slow as a sigh, the goddess of love herself eventually walked onto the shore at Cyprus, fully formed and already smiling. Even at the moment of his defeat, Uranus could not help making more children. The universe in those early days was incredibly generous about its origin stories. With his father overthrown and the sky now arched safely out of reach, Cronus took the throne of the cosmos and crowned himself ruler of everything. The Titans were released to roam, the world was theirs, and for a long stretch the place actually worked rather well. There was no winter, no need to grow food, no need to lock the door at night. The earliest humans, the ones who lived during this period, did not age, did not toil, ate what the earth offered freely, and went peacefully into a long sleep at the end of their days. The Greeks called this the Golden Age, and they would talk about it for centuries the way grandparents talk about how cheap bread used to be. It sounds, frankly, like the world's most generous all-inclusive resort, only without the buffet line. But Cronus had a small problem, and the problem was a prophecy. Before he took power, his parents had warned him, "Your time will end the same way your father's did. A child of yours will rise up, overthrow you, and take everything away." To a king who had personally toppled his own father with a stone sickle, this was not a comforting forecast. It was, in fact, the worst possible thing he could have heard, and he carried it around with him like a stone in his shoe. He had married his sister Rhea by then, a custom that was apparently fine in the early days of the cosmos, when there frankly were not many options, and the two of them began to have children. The first was Hestia, soft-eyed goddess of the hearth. The second was Demeter, who would one day rule grain and harvest. Then came Hera, proud and beautiful even as an infant. Then Hades, dark-eyed and quiet. Then Poseidon, with a temperament that already churned like rough water. 5 children, each more luminous than the last, and each one a potential prophecy come true. So Cronus did something terrible and in his own twisted logic completely reasonable. As each child was born, he took the infant from Rhea's arms and swallowed it whole, right down, in one gulp, like the world's least dignified party trick. The babies, being divine, did not die. They simply existed inside him, growing in the dark of their father's belly, while Rhea grieved and could do nothing about it. Try, if you can, to imagine being a mother to 5 children you have never seen walk, never heard speak, never been allowed to hold for more than a single fleeting moment. It is the quietest cruelty in the whole story, and the Greeks knew it. By the time the 6th pregnancy came around, Rhea had had enough. She slipped away from her husband and went to her own mother, Gaia, who knew a thing or two about being wronged by your own family. Together they hatched a plan. Rhea gave birth in secret to her 6th child, a son she named Zeus, and she hid him on the island of Crete, in a deep cave on the side of Mount Ida, where a goat named Amalthea would nurse him, and where his cries would be drowned out by armoured attendants clashing their shields together. To this day, those attendants, the curettes, get a footnote in the tale for being history's first professional babysitters with a noise complaint. Then Rhea pulled the trick that has been laughing quietly through the centuries ever since. She wrapped a stone in baby clothes, a perfectly ordinary stone picked up from the earth her mother controlled, and presented it to Cronus, weeping convincingly. Cronus, who clearly was not going to win any awards for paternal observation, took the bundle and gulped it down without so much as a glance at the contents. He had eaten a rock and never noticed. 5 children in his belly and now a 6th member of the Gravel family, and the king of the universe did not catch on. The Greeks loved this detail. It is the kind of story that gets repeated at firesides forever, because there is something universally satisfying about watching a tyrant fall for the oldest trick in the book. Up in his hidden cave, Zeus grew. He grew the way only children of gods can grow, which is to say much too quickly, and with a strength that broke the things he tried to play with. The goat Amalthea became part of his myth. One of her horns is said to have eventually become the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, forever pouring out fruits and grain. Whether this was a reward for her service or a quiet apology for the rough handling of a child who did not know his own strength, the stories do not quite agree. He was raised by mountain nymphs, taught by the wind, and grew strong on a diet of goat milk and honey, while down in the rest of the cosmos, his father continued to rule unbothered, blissfully unaware that the prophecy was now wearing sandals and learning to climb. When he was old enough, and that took less time than it sounds, when you are a god, Zeus came down off the mountain and presented himself to his father in disguise. Some versions say he posed as a cupbearer, working his way into the royal household under a false name. Others say he came with the help of a clever titaness named Metis, whose name means cunning thought, and whose talents we will hear about again. Either way, Zeus delivered to his father a draught, a special drink, prepared with something a stomach was never meant to hold. Cronus, who had spent decades comfortably digesting his own offspring, suddenly found himself violently incapable of keeping anything down. Out came the swallowed stone. First of all, exactly as it had gone in. The Greeks said it landed at Delphi, where it became a sacred object for centuries, a lump of literal rock at the centre of the most famous oracle in the ancient world. Visitors used to pour oil on it as an offering, which has to be one of the more unusual postcards in religious history. Then, one by one, out came the children Cronus had eaten. Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, all of them grown, all of them divine, all of them deeply unimpressed with their father's hospitality. Imagine being released into daylight after years inside a stomach, and your first thought is probably not gratitude. It is something colder and a lot more focused. It is, you might say, the look of someone who has waited a very long time to have a word with management. This led to the great war that the Greeks called the Titanomachy. The word means, plainly, the War of the Titans, and it lasted 10 long years across the surface of a world that had not been built to handle this kind of stress. On one side stood Cronus and his brother Titans, full-grown and ancient, lords of the previous age. On the other stood Zeus and his 5 siblings, fresh from captivity, untested but burning with grievance, joined by allies whom Cronus had never bothered to win over. Some of the younger Titans, Prometheus among them, took the side of Zeus, sensing which way the wind was beginning to blow. Prometheus, whose name means foresight, was the kind of Titan who looked at a situation, did the long arithmetic, and made his choice quietly without bothering to announce it. His brother Epimetheus, whose name means afterthought, went along with him, mostly because that was Epimetheus's policy on everything. The fighting was fierce, though we will skip past the worst of the noise. These were beings the size of mountains, and the damage they did to the landscape took generations to forget. Forests burned, seas overflowed their banks, and the sky itself cracked here and there in ways that older shepherds, in much later years, still claim to remember. For a long stretch, neither side could gain the upper hand, and the world seemed locked in a stalemate that might have gone on forever, like the longest possible football match with no referee. It was Gaia who finally tipped the scales, the same grandmother who had armed Cronus once and was now, you might say, switching teams. She whispered to Zeus that there were prisoners deep beneath the earth, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones, the ones his grandfather Uranus had shoved away long ago and whom Cronus, despite saying he would free them, had quietly kept locked up. Apparently Cronus had not seen the point in changing the locks now that he held the keys, which is fairly typical behaviour for someone who has just inherited a kingdom. Zeus listened. He went down into the darkness past gates older than the war and he set them free. The Cyclopes were grateful. They were also, as it turned out, extraordinary craftsmen. In the deep forges beneath the earth, they hammered out 3 gifts that would shape the rest of the story. For Zeus, they forged the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure white light and ear-cracking noise. For Poseidon, they shaped a trident, a 3-pronged spear that could split rock and stir the seas into mountains of foam. For Hades, they made a helm that turned its wearer invisible, useful in ways too numerous to count, and unsettling in just as many. The 100-handed ones, meanwhile, with their 50 heads each and 300 arms apiece between them, came up to the battlefield and began throwing boulders at the Titans with the dedication of a workforce that had been waiting eons for a project. The tide turned quickly after that. The Titans, exhausted from years of warfare and unprepared for thunderbolts and invisible enemies and a steady artillery of flying mountains, were overwhelmed. One by one they were defeated, bound, and cast down into Tartarus, the same dark pit beneath the earth that had once held the 100-handed ones. The gates were sealed behind them, 3 layers of bronze, watched by the very guards they had once oppressed. A few of the older generation who had taken Zeus's side, or had simply stayed out of the fighting, were spared. Atlas, who had stood at the front of the Titan army and led their lines, was given a particular punishment: to hold up the sky on his shoulders for the rest of forever, a job description that has been quoted at every reluctant employee ever since. Whenever you complain about Monday morning, somewhere a Titan is rolling his eyes and adjusting his grip. With the Titans gone and the cosmos quieter than it had been in a very long time, Zeus and his siblings climbed to the summit of a great mountain in northern Greece, Olympus, the highest peak they could find, and made it their home. From its cloud-wrapped top they could see everything below: the rivers, the islands, the long roads that humans would one day walk. The 3 brothers drew lots to divide the universe. Zeus drew the sky and was made king. Poseidon drew the sea and became its lord. Hades drew the underworld and went down to rule the realm of the dead, a job he would later claim he had been tricked into accepting, though no one was quite sure when. The earth was left common ground shared by all of them, which would later turn out to be a recipe for endless arguments and at least one major war. The 3 sisters took their places too. Hestia, eldest, claimed the hearth, the warm fire at the centre of every home, the heart of civilization itself. Of all the Olympians, she was perhaps the kindest and certainly the least likely to start a fight, which in this family was a remarkable achievement. Demeter took the grain and the harvest, becoming the goddess who would teach humans, eventually, how to coax bread out of the soil. Hera, proud and stately, set herself beside her brother Zeus as queen of the gods, in a marriage that would prove to be the most quarrelsome in the history of the cosmos, though that is a story for many later chapters and several glasses of wine. Soon other Olympians joined them at the mountain top, born in the years that followed. There was Athena, who came into the world fully grown and fully armoured, stepping out of Zeus's own head after a headache of legendary proportions. There was Apollo, the bright archer of music and prophecy, and his sister Artemis, the silver-quick huntress. There was Hermes, the quick-fingered messenger with the winged sandals, who could talk his way out of anything and frequently did. There was Ares, the god of war, whom even his own family found exhausting. There was Hephaestus, the gentle limping smith who made weapons that could decide the fate of cities. There was Dionysus, latecomer to the table, who would teach humans the joys and sorrows of wine. And there was Aphrodite, already grown, who had walked up out of the sea foam centuries before and had now taken her seat among them. 12 thrones in all, give or take, depending on which version of the seating chart you trust. So the first age closed. The primordial beings stepped back into the deep places of the world, becoming forces rather than faces. The Titans were locked away. The Olympians sat on their new thrones with their new weapons and their new domains, and for a moment, just a moment, there was peace. It would be tempting to think that with the gods firmly settled and the world finally still, the story was over. But the story was, in many ways, only just beginning, because so far everything we have followed has happened among the divine, beings made of cosmic stuff, fighting cosmic wars, eating cosmic meals. The world of mortals, the world where we eventually fit in, had not yet really started, and that world has its own peculiar way of being measured. The Greeks had a particular way of thinking about time, and it was not the neat straight line we tend to draw today. They imagined history not as a single road running forward, but as a series of distinct ages, each with its own flavour, each rising and falling like a tide. Their poets, most famously a farmer named Hesiod, who wrote down what he claimed his grandfather had taught him, described the past in great sweeping eras. Some of these are familiar even now: the Golden Age, when humans lived without toil; the Silver Age, when they lived less perfectly; the Bronze Age, when they fought too much and burned themselves out; and so on, all the way down to the Iron Age, which Hesiod believed he was living in himself, and which he described with the weary tone of a man who has seen the news in the morning paper and would very much like to lie down for a while. But beneath all those poetic divisions, the deeper framework was simpler. There were really 3 great stages to the story. First, the Age of the Gods, the long quiet stretch we have just been describing, when the cosmos was being arranged and humans had not yet entered the picture in any meaningful way. Second, the age of gods and mortals, a long bright period in which the divine walk the earth alongside ordinary people, when a god might lean over a fence to chat with a farmer or a goddess might disguise herself as a traveller to test a king's hospitality. And third, the heroic age, the time of half-divine children, the offspring of those mingled centuries who would carry out the great adventures that the Greeks loved to tell at their tables. This middle age, the age of gods and mortals, is the one we have to linger on for a moment, because everything else depends on it. When humans first appeared, and the Greeks had several stories about how this happened, none of them quite agreeing with the others, they were not the cunning, clever creatures we picture today. They were soft, slow, and easily startled. They had no fire to cook with, no tools to hunt with, no clothes to keep themselves warm. They lived on raw roots and uncooked berries, slept in caves or under leaves, and froze every winter like creatures who had not been thoroughly thought through. Frankly, it was not a great design, and the gods who watched from Olympus were divided about what to do. Zeus, by this point, was settling into his role as king, and had developed the slightly impatient attitude common to anyone who feels they have already done their share of the heavy lifting. He thought humans were fine the way they were, limited, brief, and not too clever. There was no need, in his view, to upgrade them. They were like a hobby he had grown bored with halfway through. But Prometheus, who had survived the war by switching sides and who had a soft spot for these wobbling creatures, looked at humanity with something gentler. He decided to do something about it. Prometheus stole fire. He did this, depending on which version you trust, by either hiding a glowing ember inside a hollow fennel stalk and slipping it down from Olympus, or by sneaking close to the sun's chariot and lighting a torch from the wheel itself. He carried fire down to the cold, dark places where humans were huddled, and he showed them how to keep it alive, how to feed it, how to use it. With fire came cooking, and with cooking came warmth, and with warmth came survival through winter, and with survival came the slow, stubborn climb toward civilization. Bread was baked, pots were fired, bronze was eventually smelted. Whole villages stayed up later than they should have telling stories, which has been a problem for productivity ever since. Zeus was, to put it mildly, displeased. The story of his anger is one of the more dramatic chapters in the early myths, though much of it tends to focus on the personal punishment of Prometheus, which we will only sketch lightly here. The Titan was bound to a high rock at the edge of the world and made to suffer the same renewed torment each day, a sentence designed to last forever, though one that would eventually be ended by a particular hero we will meet in the next chapter. As for humanity, Zeus chose a subtler revenge. He had a being crafted, not born, but made, by the smith god Hephaestus, who shaped her out of earth and water, and gave her the form of a woman more beautiful than any human had yet seen. Athena gave her clever fingers and a gift for weaving. Aphrodite gave her grace and charm. Hermes, who could never resist a complication, gave her curiosity and a quick tongue. They named her Pandora, which means all gifted because every god had contributed something, and she was sent down to earth as a present for the brother of Prometheus, Epimetheus, whose own name, as we have heard, means afterthought. Prometheus had warned his brother never to accept a gift from Zeus. Epimetheus, true to his name, forgot. Pandora arrived carrying a jar, not the box of later mistranslations, but a great clay storage jar sealed tight at the mouth. She had been told not to open it, and we all know how that kind of instruction tends to go. One quiet afternoon, alone in her new home, with the jar sitting in the corner and her curiosity finally getting the better of her, she lifted the lid just a crack to peek inside. What came out were all the troubles that had been bottled away from the world: sickness, sorrow, jealousy, anger, hunger, exhaustion, the particular cruelty of strangers. All the things that had been kept neatly tucked into that jar swarmed out into the air like a cloud of dark wings, and they have been with humanity ever since. Pandora slammed the lid back on, but by then almost everything was already loose in the world. The only thing left at the very bottom of the jar, trapped under the closing lid, was hope. Small, fragile, quiet, but still there. The Greeks were not sentimental people, and even they could not quite decide whether keeping hope inside the jar was a kindness or a final cruelty. Some said it was the one comfort humanity could still call on when the world pressed down. Others said it was simply the last thing the gods had withheld from us. Either way, the jar was closed, and the long, bright morning of the age of gods and mortals began to shade toward evening. It is worth pausing here for a moment to picture the human world as Hesiod and his fellow poets imagined it during these early centuries, because the rhythm of the ages they described is the heartbeat behind everything still to come. The Golden Age, as we have said, had been the easy one. The long, warm afternoon of the cosmos when nobody worked very hard and nobody died with much fuss. The Silver Age that followed was strange and a little sad. People lived for 100 years as children, kept by their mothers, and then aged and faded quickly afterwards, with very little time to be anything in between. They had grown proud, the poets said, and forgot to honour the gods, which earned them a quiet end. The Bronze Age came next, and these were a harder breed altogether. They were born from ash trees rather than from soft clay, and they made their armour out of bronze, their houses out of bronze, their tools out of bronze, until a person could hardly sit down without ringing slightly. They loved war the way some people love a long argument, and they eventually wore themselves out fighting each other into the shadows. After them came the heroic age, the one that interests us most, and beneath that, in Hesiod's gloomy ranking, the Iron Age that he believed he himself was living in. We are still in it if you take him seriously, which is either a comforting thought or an extremely unsettling one depending on your mood. The point of the framework, though, is not the exact accounting of ages. The point is that the Greeks saw history as a slow decline, a gradual cooling, with the very best times already behind them. They were perhaps the first culture to look back over their shoulder and decide that their grandparents had had it better. They were not the last. There is another story, less famous but worth a moment, about how this age nearly ended altogether. Zeus grew so frustrated with the noisy, quarrelsome humans of the Bronze Age that he decided briefly to start over. He sent a great flood, raised up from the seas and dropped down from the sky, and most of the human race was washed away in a single long week. Only one couple was spared, a man named Deucalion, a son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha. They had been warned in advance and built themselves a wooden chest, which floated on the rising waters until the rain stopped. When they finally stepped out onto wet ground, they were the only two people left in the world. An oracle told them to walk forward and throw the bones of their mother behind them as they went. They puzzled over this until they realized the mother in question was Gaia, the earth herself, and her bones were the stones underfoot. So they bent and gathered up stones and tossed them over their shoulders, and behind them, where each stone landed, a new human rose up out of the soil. Men from the stones Deucalion threw, women from the stones Pyrrha threw. The human race began again, which is a tidier solution than it had any right to be. For centuries afterward, the gods still walked among humans, but more carefully now. They came in disguise, often as travellers, and they tested hospitality. A poor old couple in a hillside cottage might receive 2 weary visitors at their door, share what little they had, and learn afterwards that they had hosted Zeus and Hermes themselves, and be rewarded with a long happy life and a quiet shared death at the same hour. Other households, less generous, did not fare as well. The stories of these visitations became one of the great themes of Greek religion, the idea that anyone you turn away at the door might be a god, that hospitality is sacred precisely because you cannot always tell. But the gods also continued to do something else, something with consequences. They continued to fall, often and easily, for the mortals they saw. Zeus was the worst offender, a fact his queen Hera tracked with the patience of an accountant building a long case for divorce. A god might fall for a mortal woman in a wheat field. A goddess might fall for a young shepherd singing on a hill. These attractions were rarely permanent. They were rarely even balanced, but they produced children, and the children of those unions were neither fully divine nor fully mortal. They were stronger than ordinary humans, swifter, often more handsome, often more troubled. They aged slower. They felt more sharply. They were called heroes, and they would dominate the next great age. A hero to the Greeks was not what we sometimes mean by the word today. A hero was not necessarily kind. A hero was not necessarily honest. A hero was a being of mixed blood, half divine and half mortal, marked out by some quality larger than ordinary human size, strength, cunning, beauty or skill, and burdened by a destiny too heavy for a normal life. Heroes attracted trouble the way magnets attract iron filings. They were prone to terrible mistakes, and they were prone to extraordinary deeds, and the two were often the same act seen from different angles. The gods began to step back as the heroic age opened. They did not vanish, not yet. There would be plenty of times when a goddess would still bend to whisper advice in a hero's ear, or a god would still appear in a flash of light to lend a hand or to take one away. But the easy daily contact began to fade. Olympus became a more distant place. The mortals who had once received gods at their tables now mostly received their messengers, or their portents, or their dreams. The boundary, once thin enough to step across in the cool of the evening, began to thicken. There were practical reasons for this withdrawal, at least in the storyteller's logic. As humans multiplied, became more numerous, built cities, fought wars, and generally got noisier and busier, the gods had less interest in personal involvement and more in being honoured from a distance. Temples replaced shared meals, sacrifices replaced conversations. The gods had not stopped caring about humans, but they had begun to prefer the smell of grilled meat rising from an altar to the slow business of debating philosophy with a shepherd. Honestly, who could blame them? Anyone who has tried to leave a small-talk conversation politely will recognise the impulse. And so, by the time we were ready to meet our first hero, the world had taken its familiar shape. The gods were on their mountaintop, mortals were on their plains and shorelines. Between them, scattered across the islands and kingdoms of the Mediterranean, were the children of mixed blood. Princes whose mothers had been visited by Zeus, princesses whose fathers had been touched by Apollo, warriors whose grandmothers had once danced with a god in disguise at a country festival and had never quite told anyone about it afterwards. These were the heroes who would soon find themselves walking into stories far larger than they had bargained for, and from whose names whole constellations and city walls and rivers would later be named. Perseus, who would one day fly across the sea on winged sandals. Theseus, who would walk into a stone labyrinth carrying nothing but a ball of thread. Jason, who would gather the greatest crew ever assembled onto a single ship and sail to the far edge of the known world for the sake of a golden fleece. Achilles, whose mother would dip him into a river to make him invincible and somehow miss a single heel. Atalanta, the swift huntress who could outrun any man and chose her husband on her own terms. And, towering above them all in sheer strength, a boy born in the city of Thebes to a mortal mother and to Zeus himself, whose destiny was so heavy that even his own divine father seemed to flinch when he saw what was coming. That boy's mother had been deceived to bring him into the world. His stepmother on Olympus would resent him from his first breath. He would grow into the strongest man who had ever lived, and he would also become one of the most tormented men who had ever lived, which is a combination the Greeks found endlessly fascinating. His name, though it began as something else, and was changed in midlife as a kind of bitter joke, would become a word that even today still means doing the impossible. The cosmos had been arranged. The gods had taken their thrones. The titans were locked away beneath the earth. Humans had been given fire and trouble in roughly equal measure. The first heroes were stirring in their cradles across the Greek world, unaware of the long roads waiting for them. Some would be raised in palaces. Some would be raised in forests by centaurs who knew more about herbs and stars than most kings did. Some would not learn whose blood ran in their veins until they were grown men with families of their own, and the discovery would change everything they thought they knew about themselves. The age of gods and mortals was ending. The heroic age was about to begin, and the next part of the night belongs to the strongest of them all. The strongest of them all began his life, naturally, in a story about deception. The kingdom of Thebes, in the years before our hero properly entered the picture, was not a particularly remarkable place. It sat in the green plains of central Greece, with 7 sturdy gates, a respectable wall, and a royal family that had survived a fair share of family drama already. Their king was a good-looking warrior named Amphitryon, who had married his cousin Alcmene, a princess so beautiful that strangers stopped on the road to look at her, and so clever that she had set conditions for the marriage which Amphitryon had been working off for years. She had asked him, before the wedding, to avenge the killing of her brothers, a long-standing family grievance that involved a distant island and a fair amount of complicated geography. Amphitryon had agreed, the way young men in love tend to agree to almost anything, and so, on the very evening of his wedding, he had to march off to war instead of staying with his bride. He kissed Alcmene goodbye in their newly arranged bedchamber, promised to come home a conquering hero, and set off with his soldiers into the long Mediterranean dusk. Alcmene, left behind with the lamps lit and the wedding wine still warm in its jar, sat alone with a husband she had not yet been allowed to know. Up on Olympus, of course, somebody noticed. Zeus, who had been watching the affairs of the mortal world the way one might watch a particularly absorbing soap opera, took note of Alcmene's situation. He saw the empty bedchamber. He saw the absent husband. He saw, above all, Alcmene herself, and as we have already learned, Zeus's self-control around mortal women was famously somewhere between distracted and entirely missing. He decided to pay a visit. But there was a complication. Alcmene was not the kind of woman one tricked easily, and she was deeply, sincerely in love with her husband. A clever god knows when to admit defeat and when to get creative. Zeus chose the second option. He went down to earth wearing the exact shape of Amphitryon, his face, his voice, his slight limp from an old hunting accident, the small scar over his left eyebrow. He arrived at the palace gates dressed in Amphitryon's travelling cloak, carrying spoils of the war as proof, and announced that the campaign had been successful, that he had ridden home ahead of his army for a single private night with his bride. Alcmene naturally did not question it. The man at her door looked, sounded, and behaved exactly like her husband. He had the right scar. He had the right walk. He even brought back the kind of small story that only Amphitryon would have told, some detail about an old comrade or a borrowed sword. She welcomed him in with a relief so deep her hands trembled, and the long-delayed wedding night finally took place, except that the bridegroom was not in fact her husband. Now Zeus, having gone to considerable trouble, did not intend to stay only one night. He used his powers to slow the rising of the sun. Some versions say he tripled the length of that single night, stretching it across 3 turns of the sky, so that what passed under that lamplit roof took longer than any night in human history. The sun, presumably, was not consulted. By the time dawn finally arrived, Zeus had slipped away. And here is the strange comedy of timing that makes this story so famously Greek. As the false Amphitryon vanished, the real Amphitryon arrived. He came home dusty and victorious, bursting through his own front gates with the cheerful confidence of a man returning to his bride for the first time. He found Alcmene resting, surprised at his enthusiasm and slightly confused, since in her mind they had already enjoyed their reunion the night before. They had a brief and bewildered conversation about it. Amphitryon, sensible man that he was, took her at her word, suspected something divine was afoot, and consulted a seer. The seer confirmed it. A god had visited. There was nothing to be done. What was done, however, was a child, or rather, 2 of them. Alcmene became pregnant with twins, one fathered by Zeus and one by Amphitryon, conceived on consecutive nights, or possibly within the same triple night, depending on which storyteller you ask. Heracles, the son of Zeus, would be born first by a few moments. His twin brother Iphicles, son of the mortal husband, would follow, or so the plan had been. Up on Olympus, Hera was watching, and Hera missed nothing. Hera, queen of the gods, had been married to Zeus for longer than most mountains had been standing, and she had developed a hard, watchful patience about his constant infidelities. She did not always blame the women themselves, though sometimes she did, and the consequences for them were considerable. She blamed Zeus, but Zeus was unreachable, untouchable, and entirely beyond consequences, so Hera's anger tended to land sideways, on his children by other women. Heracles, even before he was born, had been chosen as a particular target. It happened like this. Zeus, full of himself and not thinking quite as carefully as he should have, made a public announcement on Olympus that very day. He declared that a child of his blood, born today in the line of his great descendant Perseus, would grow up to rule all of the kingdoms of the south. He meant Heracles. He should have stopped there, but Zeus rarely stopped there. He sealed the prophecy with a solemn oath, sworn on the river Styx, which no god could ever break. Hera saw her opening at once. She slipped down to earth and worked 2 pieces of magic simultaneously, the kind of sleight of hand that comes only from centuries of practice. First, she went to another woman of the Perseus family, a queen named Nisipo, who was also pregnant. Hera hurried that birth along, pulling the baby, a boy named Eurystheus, into the world weeks before he was due. Then she went to Thebes and slowed Alcmene's labour. She sent the goddess of childbirth, Eileithyia, to sit on the threshold of Alcmene's chamber with her arms crossed and her legs tightly knotted at the ankles, a posture which, in the magical logic of these stories, prevented any baby from coming out as long as it held. For 7 days and 7 nights Alcmene laboured without being able to give birth. The household was in despair. Then a clever serving girl named Galanthis, looking out into the courtyard and noticing the strange goddess sitting too still, ran out and announced loudly and joyfully that the baby had been born and the lady was well. Eileithyia jumped up in surprise to see what had gone wrong, and the moment her crossed arms uncrossed, Alcmene's labour broke open and Heracles was at last born. Galanthis unfortunately paid for her cleverness. Hera, in a fit of pique, turned the girl into a weasel for the trick, which is one of those punishments that seems both petty and exhaustingly thorough at the same time. Iphicles followed shortly after, and the twins lay in their cradles, one half divine and one fully mortal, both beautiful in the candlelight. But the damage to Zeus's oath had already been done. Eurystheus, the other baby, the one Hera had hurried into the world ahead of schedule, was now technically the firstborn of the Perseus line on that fateful day. Zeus's oath, sworn unbreakably on the Styx, now applied to him. Eurystheus, a small, frail, unremarkable infant, was now the destined ruler of those southern kingdoms. Heracles, the chosen son, had lost his throne before he had even opened his eyes. Zeus stamped and raged and threatened, but the oath was the oath, and even the king of the gods could not undo it. Olympus, on that morning, must have felt very quiet. Hera, having stolen the kingdom from him, was not finished. When the twin boys were perhaps 8 or 9 months old, she sent 2 enormous serpents into their nursery one night, dropping them down through a window. They slithered toward the cradle with the calm patience of a problem about to be solved. Iphicles, the mortal twin, did the sensible thing. He screamed his head off and tried to climb out of the cradle. Heracles, who was, even at less than a year old, not built like other babies, sat up, took one serpent in each chubby fist and squeezed. By the time Alcmene and Amphitryon came running in, terrified by the noise, the 2 snakes were limp ropes in the baby's hands, and Heracles was looking up at his parents with the placid satisfaction of a child who has discovered a new and interesting toy. The seer Tiresias, the famous blind prophet of Thebes, was called in the next morning to interpret the omen. He gave the family a long, careful prediction. This child, he said, would do more than any mortal had ever done. He would walk paths no one had walked before. He would become a friend of the gods eventually, but the road ahead would be hard, and he would suffer much before any of it came true. Alcmene clutched her baby and tried not to cry. Heracles grew the way you would expect such a child to grow. By his teens he was already strong enough to wrestle bears for sport, swift enough to outrun deer, and possessed of a temper that needed careful handling. He was sent to learn the standard skills of a young prince: archery from a famous archer named Eurytus, chariot driving from his stepfather Amphitryon, wrestling from a son of Hermes, and music from a respected teacher named Linus. Music unfortunately did not go well. Heracles had no patience for the lyre, and when Linus tried to correct him too sharply one afternoon, the young hero struck back with the instrument itself. The blow was harder than Heracles had meant it to be, and the lesson ended badly for the teacher. The local court acquitted Heracles on the grounds of provocation, but the incident was an early warning. He did not know his own strength, and bad things sometimes happened when he forgot. After that he was sent out into the country to live among shepherds, partly to keep him out of trouble in the city, and partly to let him grow into himself in a quieter setting. There, alone with the cattle and the mountains, he came to a famous fork in the road. Not a real fork, but the kind that lives in stories, where 2 figures appeared to him as he sat thinking about his future. One was a soft, perfumed woman who promised him a life of easy pleasures, feasts, ease, beauty, comfort, and never any difficult work. The other was a plain, sober woman who promised him a life of toil, struggle, danger, and eventually a kind of glory that would outlast his bones. He chose the second. The Greeks loved this story, and it has been retold in 100 different ways down through the centuries, because at the heart of it is the question every young person has to answer eventually, even if no one usually shows up on a hillside to make it official. In his early manhood he had real adventures, before his great labours even began. He helped his city of Thebes win a war against a neighbouring kingdom, and as a reward the king of Thebes, a man named Creon, gave him his eldest daughter, Megara, in marriage. They were happy together. Heracles, when not dealing with monsters in the countryside, was apparently a perfectly affectionate husband and father. They had children. The exact count varies wildly between different sources, somewhere between 2 and 8, with 3 or 4 being the most common number. He was building, by all accounts, the family life of a contented retired hero. He had a courtyard, a fig tree, a wife who laughed at his bad jokes, The youngest child was just learning to walk. Hera was watching. She had not forgotten him. She had been waiting in her patient way for him to settle, for him to become content, for him to have things he could lose. When Heracles was at the peak of his happiness, surrounded by his young family, comfortable in his own home, Hera unleashed her oldest and worst weapon. She sent a madness down upon him. It descended like a fog rolling in from the sea. Heracles, walking through his own house one evening, no longer saw what was in front of him. The room blurred, the walls bent. He saw enemies where there were none. He saw shapes in the doorways that were not there. He believed himself to be in the middle of a battle, surrounded by foes fighting for his life, and in that terrible blindness, in that dark fog that Hera had wrapped around his mind, the worst thing happened that could have happened in his own home. By the time the fog lifted, by the time his vision cleared and the gods released him from the madness, his family was gone. The home he had built with his own hands was a ruin. He came back to himself in the wreckage and understood what had happened. He understood that even though it had not been him in any meaningful sense, that it had been Hera using him as her weapon, the hands had still been his hands. The Greeks were unsparing about this. He sat in the ruins of his own life and did not rise for a long time. He stopped eating. He stopped speaking. His friend Theseus, the Prince of Athens, came to him in those dark days and would not leave his side, holding him through the worst of the despair, refusing to let him be alone with his thoughts. Eventually, when Heracles could stand again, he did what any Greek would have done in the wreckage of guilt and grief. He set out for Delphi to ask the oracle what could be done. The oracle at Delphi was the most important sacred site in the Greek world, a temple built on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where a priestess called the Pythia sat over a crack in the rock and breathed vapours that came up from the deep places of the earth. Her answers were famously cryptic, often impossible to interpret until afterwards, when the events they described had already happened. But for Heracles, the Pythia gave a clear answer. He must go, she said, to Tiryns. He must place himself in the service of the king of that small southern kingdom. He must perform whatever tasks that king set him, for as many years as the king required. Only then would the stain be washed away. Only then might he be forgiven. She also, the Pythia, gave him his name. Until that moment he had been called Alcides, after his grandfather. From now on, she said, he would be called Heracles, which means the glory of Hera. The bitter joke was deliberate. The very goddess who had ruined him would, through his suffering, give him his legend. And the king of Tiryns, of course, was Eurystheus. The same Eurystheus who had been pushed early into the world so that he could take the throne meant for Heracles. The same Eurystheus who had grown up frail and bitter, fully aware that he held a crown that should have belonged to his stronger cousin. Now Heracles, the man Eurystheus had spent his whole life envying and fearing, would have to come to Eurystheus's court and bow before him, and ask, every morning, what task the king required. The Greeks loved this kind of bitter geometry. The oppressor of the hero's youth would now be the master of his middle age. The man who had stolen Heracles' birthright would now command him to clean stables and chase deer and fetch impossible fruit. And Hera, watching from Olympus, must have smiled the first true smile she'd smiled in years. Heracles arrived at Tiryns to find his cousin Eurystheus waiting on a throne that looked, frankly, too big for him. Eurystheus was a small man, narrow-shouldered, easily startled, the kind of king who flinched when doors closed too loudly. Now suddenly he had at his disposal the strongest mortal who had ever lived, sworn by divine command to obey him. It was on paper a tyrant's dream come true. In practice, Eurystheus mostly used the situation to send Heracles as far away from Tiryns as possible, on tasks designed to either finish him off or keep him gone for a long time. He had a habit, the stories say, of hiding in a great bronze jar buried in the floor of his throne room whenever Heracles returned from a particularly successful mission, communicating with the hero only through a herald named Copreus, whose name in Greek means roughly dung man, and who appears to have been chosen for that thankless position by some divine sense of comedy. The labours that followed are usually counted as 12, though the number was originally 10. Eurystheus refused to credit 2 of them on technicalities, which is the kind of petty bureaucratic move that makes you want to reach into the page and shake him. They are best understood not as a list of chores, but as a slow transformation, a series of trials each designed to break Heracles down and remake him into something else. They can be grouped, roughly, into 3 kinds: the beasts he had to overcome, the creatures and people he had to capture, and the impossible journeys he had to make to the edges of the world. The first group, the beasts, were monsters who had been terrorizing the countryside for years. Eurystheus had probably been hoping that one of them would finish his cousin off, which would have neatly solved the problem of having such a dangerous relative on the payroll. The first labour took Heracles to the valley of Nemea, where a lion had been living for some time, and not the ordinary kind. This was an enormous golden-furred beast whose hide could not be pierced by any weapon. No spear, no arrow, no sword, no club. The local shepherds had given up trying. Heracles spent days tracking the lion through the hills, found its den, which turned out to have 2 entrances. A small architectural detail that made the hunt considerably more complicated, and finally chose the only solution available. He blocked one entrance with stones, went into the den through the other, and dealt with the beast bare-handed since weapons were useless against the hide. It took a long time. When he came out at last, he was carrying the lion's body across his shoulders. He could not skin the creature with any blade he owned. Eventually he realized that the lion's own claws were the only thing sharp enough to cut its own hide, and he used them to make himself a cloak. From that day forward, Heracles wore the lion's pelt around his shoulders, with the head as a kind of hood, which became his trademark across the rest of his life. The strongest man in the world, draped in the skin of the strongest monster he had ever met. He looked, in those early years, exactly like the kind of person you would not want to meet on a quiet road at dusk. The second labour was the Hydra of Lerna, a many-headed water serpent that lived in the swamps near the city of Argos. The Hydra was a problem of a different shape entirely. It had 9 heads, or possibly more, and if you cut one off, 2 new heads grew back from the stump, so every blow only made the creature worse. Heracles, who had brought along his nephew Iolaus to help, worked the problem out together. As Heracles cut off each head, Iolaus would press a burning torch to the wound, cauterizing it before new heads could grow back. The pair of them worked their way around the creature like that, methodically, until only the central head remained. Heracles cut that one off too and buried it under an enormous boulder, where it presumably still sits and grumbles. This was the first of the labours that Eurystheus refused to count, on the grounds that Heracles had received help from his nephew. Bureaucracy, even in the heroic age, was alive and well. Then came a series of beasts that had to be brought back alive, not slain. The Erymanthian boar was a giant tusked menace that lived high in the mountains of Arcadia, and Heracles had to drive it into deep snowdrifts to slow it down, then bind it and carry it back on his shoulders. When he reached Tiryns with the boar trussed and snorting on his back, Eurystheus took one look at it and jumped into his bronze jar. The herald Capreus was sent out to receive the trophy, presumably from the safer distance the jar provided. On the way home from that labour incidentally, Heracles also accidentally started a small war with the centaurs, who lived in those same mountains. He was a hard man to send anywhere without consequences. The Cretan bull was a magnificent white animal that had once belonged to King Minos of Crete, and had been driven wild by Poseidon as part of an entirely separate story involving the king's failure to make a proper sacrifice. The bull was now rampaging across the island. Heracles travelled by ship, tracked the animal down, and brought it under control with patience and steady physical strength, then ferried it back to the mainland. Eurystheus, characteristically, did not know what to do with a live bull and ended up releasing it, which is one of those decisions that sounds reasonable for about 30 seconds until the bull starts trampling things again somewhere else. The mares of Diomedes were 4 horses kept by a brutal northern king who had treated his animals so badly that they had become entirely unmanageable. Heracles took the horses, brought their owner to a fitting end in the way the Greeks always seem to enjoy in stories about cruel kings, and led the animals back across the sea to Tiryns. Once removed from the situation that had ruined them, the horses calmed down considerably and lived out quiet lives in a meadow near the city. Heracles had a way of bringing peace to creatures that had been driven half mad by their previous owners, which is one of the gentler details that the loud stories tend to skip over. The next group of labours involved creatures that had to be captured carefully, often without harming them at all. The Ceryneian hind was a deer with golden antlers and bronze hooves, sacred to the goddess Artemis. Heracles could not harm it without offending Artemis directly, and offending Artemis directly was the kind of mistake you only made once. But the deer was the swiftest creature in the world and could outrun anything that breathed. He chased that deer for a full year, across mountains and rivers and forests. all the way to the river that the Greeks said marked the edge of the known world and back again. Finally, when even the deer was exhausted, he managed to capture it alive, slung it gently over his shoulders, and brought it home. On the way back, he ran into Artemis herself, who was, understandably, not pleased to see a man carrying her favourite deer through the woods. He explained the situation, asked her forgiveness, and promised to set the animal free as soon as Eurystheus had seen it. She let him pass. Heracles brought the deer to court. Eurystheus admired it from a safe distance, and Heracles, true to his word, gently set it down at the edge of the forest and watched it bound away into the trees. Some labours had a softer texture than others. The Stymphalian birds were a flock of metal-feathered birds that had taken over a great marsh and were tearing up everything that came near, including the unfortunate occasional traveller. The marsh was too soft to walk on and too thick to wade through. Heracles, stuck on the edge, was given a clever gift by Athena, a great bronze rattle made specially for the purpose. He shook the rattle, and the noise terrified the birds into the air. As they rose in panic, he picked them off with his arrows. The few that survived flew far away and never came back. It is one of the few labours that has a slightly cartoonish quality to it, like something from an early animated short, complete with a hero standing in the reeds, shaking what is essentially a divine maraca. The cattle of Geryon were a herd of magnificent red oxen, kept by a three-bodied giant who lived on an island at the very western edge of the world, in a place the Greeks called Erythea. Getting there required Heracles to cross the entire Mediterranean. He set up the famous Pillars of Heracles on either side of the strait that is now called Gibraltar, marking the boundary of the known world as a kind of warning sign for future travellers. The sun god Helios lent him a great golden cup to sail in, after Heracles, frustrated by the heat, had threatened to shoot at the sun with his arrows, which Helios apparently found more amusing than offensive. Heracles travelled west in this strange vessel, dealt with the giant's two-headed guard dog and the giant's herdsman and the giant himself, and brought the entire herd back overland through what is now Spain, France, and Italy. The journey took years. Cows escaped along the way. He retrieved them. More cows escaped. He retrieved them again. Whole local legends in those regions later claimed that Heracles had passed through their valleys, which they used as an excuse to put his image on coins for 1,000 years afterward. The belt of Hippolyta was a piece of armoured leather worn by the Queen of the Amazons, the legendary women warriors who lived on the edges of the Greek world. The belt had been given to Hippolyta by her father, the war god Ares. Heracles sailed to the Amazon kingdom with a small crew of friends, and Hippolyta, perhaps to her later regret since this was the version that ended best, actually agreed to give him the belt freely after he explained why he needed it. The two of them seemed to have understood each other, but Hera, still busy in the background of every story, slipped down to the kingdom in the form of an Amazon and spread the rumour that the Greeks had come to take their queen by force. The Amazons attacked. There was a battle. Hippolyta was lost in the chaos. The versions vary on exactly how, and Heracles sailed home with the belt, carrying with him a heaviness that took some of the shine off the victory. Not every labour ended with a clean triumph. Many of them left the hero quieter than they had found him. The last group of labours took Heracles to places where no living man was supposed to go. The Augean stables were the first of these, and on the surface they sounded almost like a joke. King Augeas of Elis owned the largest cattle herd in the Greek world, and his stables had not been cleaned in many, many years. The accumulated mess was, in plain terms, biblical in scale, the kind of project that an entire city's worth of workers could not have finished in a season. Eurystheus, perhaps trying to humiliate his cousin, ordered Heracles to clean the entire complex in a single day. Heracles looked at the situation, considered the volume, and decided to solve it with engineering. He went to the nearby river, dug a new channel, and diverted the entire river through the stables. The water did the work in a single rushing afternoon, sluicing everything out and into the valley below. Augeas had agreed to pay Heracles in cattle if he could clean the stables. After Heracles succeeded, the king refused to pay, claiming Heracles had only done the work as part of his service to Eurystheus. Eurystheus, when he heard about it, refused to count the labour for exactly the opposite reason, that Heracles had been promised payment in the first place. The two kings cancelled each other out with airtight logic, and Heracles, philosophical, accepted that he had 2 extra labours to do. The apples of the Hesperides were golden fruit that grew on a tree in a garden at the far western edge of the world, tended by the daughters of the evening, the Hesperides, and guarded by a great serpent with 100 heads. The tree had been a wedding gift from Gaia to Hera herself, which made stealing from it particularly delicate, given who had set Heracles on this whole road in the first place. He travelled across most of the known world to reach the garden. Along the way he wrestled a wrestler king who challenged every passerby and could not be defeated by ordinary means. He freed Prometheus from his eternal punishment, finally repaying the Titan who had given humans fire so long ago, and Prometheus, grateful, gave him a piece of advice that would matter at the very end of the journey. "Do not pick the apples yourself," the Titan said. "Find another way." Heracles eventually reached the giant Atlas, who was still holding up the sky as he had been ever since the Titanomachy. Atlas, it turned out, was the father of the Hesperides, and he offered to fetch the apples himself if Heracles would hold up the sky for him, just for a little while. Heracles, remembering Prometheus's advice, agreed. Atlas went to the garden, plucked the apples, and came back, and then, breathing fresh free air for the first time in eons, told Heracles he had a better idea. He, Atlas, would now go and deliver the apples to Eurystheus himself. Heracles could just keep holding the sky. Heracles, who had not survived everything by being stupid, agreed cheerfully, and then politely asked if Atlas could just take the sky back for one moment, so he could adjust his shoulders and place a folded cloak underneath for padding. Atlas, who had not learned much during his long shift, set down the apples and took the sky back. Heracles picked up the apples and walked away, leaving the Titan once again under his ancient burden, and presumably also under a slow and slowly dawning sense of having been outsmarted. The Greeks loved this story. They told it for centuries. There is something deeply satisfying about watching a hero use his cleverness just once, instead of his strength. The 12th and final labour was the hardest of all, to go down into the underworld, the realm of Hades, and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the gate of the dead. No living mortal was supposed to enter the underworld at all, let alone walk out of it. Heracles was initiated into the secret rites at Eleusis to prepare himself for the journey, ceremonies so sacred that the Greeks who participated never wrote down what happened inside them, and even now, 3,000 years later, nobody is entirely certain what those rites involved. He found a way down, some versions say through a cave at the southernmost tip of Greece, others through a different entrance, and made his slow way across the dark river Styx, past the ghosts of those who had once been alive, past the great judges of the dead, until he stood at last before Hades himself in his shadowy hall. Hades, surprisingly, was almost gracious about it. He had a respect for the difficulty of what Heracles had done just to reach him. The two of them spoke for a long time. There were debts settled. There was, in some versions, a brief reunion with a friend or two who had passed on before, and Hades agreed to let the hero take Cerberus on one condition. The dog could only be subdued without weapons. Heracles, who had been doing things bare-handed since infancy, was not bothered. He wrestled the 3-headed dog into submission, gentled it as much as such a creature could be gentled, slung it across his shoulders, and walked it back up out of the underworld into the daylight, where the creature blinked confusedly at the sun for what may well have been the first time in its life. He brought Cerberus to Tiryns and showed it to Eurystheus, who took one look at 3 sets of bared teeth and went straight into his bronze jar so fast he probably bruised his elbows. Cerberus was then returned to its post at the gates of the dead, which was probably the gentlest thing for everyone involved. That was the last labour. The terms of the oracle's command had been fulfilled. Heracles had served his time. He had cleaned stables and chased deer and fetched fruit, and dragged the guardian of the dead into the open air, and through it all he had been changed. He had not begun as a careful man. He had begun as a man of raw strength and uncertain judgment, prone to hot tempers and tragic mistakes. He ended these years as something different. He had learned patience on the year-long chase after the deer. He had learned engineering in the stables. He had learned diplomacy with Atlas and with Hades. He had learned slowly that strength alone solved very little, and that cleverness was the steadier weapon. He had also learned, somewhere along the way, that monsters and beasts were sometimes only animals driven mad by bad circumstances, and that mercy, when it could be afforded, was a quieter kind of strength than the loud one he was famous for. The labours had been a punishment, in their original purpose, but by the end of them they had become something else, a long, hard apprenticeship in being a different kind of man. The Greeks understood this perfectly, which is why the story has stayed alive for so long. Punishment that ends in transformation is the oldest shape in all of literature, It is the shape of every story about a person who started out one way and ended up another, every story about a debt that turns into a gift, every story about a soul that gets ground down to its essential parts and then rebuilt sturdier than before. He came back from Cerberus a free man at last. Eurystheus, with no more labours to assign, finally had to declare him released from service. Heracles walked out of Tiryns for the last time, the lion skin still on his shoulders, but his eyes different than they had been when he first walked in. He had a long life still ahead of him, more adventures, more triumphs, more sorrows, and eventually a death that would lift him onto Olympus itself, where even Hera would finally accept him as her own. But those parts of his story belonged to other nights and other tellings. For now the labours were over, the stain was washed clean. The strongest man who had ever lived had become, against all odds, something closer to a wise one. And on the long road out of Tiryns, walking west into the evening light with no particular destination in mind, he looked, for the first time in his life, like a man at peace with himself. The story of Heracles ends with a man at peace with himself on a road heading west. But it leaves us with a question worth pausing over, because the answer shapes everything that comes next. What exactly was a hero to the Greeks? It is a word so worn smooth by modern use that we hardly notice how much it has changed since the days when it actually meant something specific. When we use the word today, we usually mean someone selfless, someone kind, someone who saved another person at risk to themselves. A firefighter is a hero. A nurse during a difficult winter is a hero. The neighbour who shovels your driveway before you're even awake is, on a good day, a small hero. The word has come to mean almost the same thing as the word saint, only with the religious accent filed off. This is not what the Greeks meant, not even close. A hero in the Greek sense was first and foremost a being of mixed blood, half divine, half mortal, the product of one of those mountainside encounters between a god and a human that we have already met more than once in this story. This was not a status you earned. It was a status you inherited. You were not a hero because you had done heroic things. You were a hero because of who your parents had been, and the great deeds that followed were the consequence, not the cause, of what you were. The blood made the legend possible. The deeds simply revealed it. The second thing a Greek hero was, almost without exception, was deeply, even spectacularly flawed. Their flaws were not small embarrassing habits you could overlook after the second cup of wine. Their flaws were the same scale as their virtues, blown up to the size of the rest of them. Achilles, the greatest warrior in the world, was also one of the angriest men ever described in poetry, and his rage cost more lives than his courage saved. Odysseus, the cleverest man in the world, used that cleverness for trickery and deception so often that even his allies sometimes had to count their fingers after shaking his hand. Theseus, the founder king of Athens, abandoned the woman who had saved his life on a deserted island, and forgot to change his ship's sails on the way home, a small detail that killed his own father. Jason promised the witch Medea his eternal love, and then jilted her for a younger princess as soon as it became politically convenient. Bellerophon flew up to Olympus on a winged horse to demand his own divinity, which did not go particularly well. Oedipus, the smartest man in his city, was blind to the one fact about himself that mattered most. The list goes on. Every great Greek hero comes with a footnote in small print about the catastrophe they caused, often to the people who loved them best. This was not, in the Greek mind, a bug. It was a feature. The flaws were not what disqualified a hero from being a hero. They were part of what made him one. To the Greeks, the gods themselves were flawed, jealous, petty, vain, easily offended, and the children of the gods inherited those flaws along with their oversized strength and beauty. The hero was, in many ways, the most fully human kind of person imaginable, because the hero was a person at full intensity. Every quality, good and bad, turned up to the maximum volume. Where ordinary people felt a little annoyed, the hero raged. Where ordinary people felt mild affection, the hero loved obsessively. Where ordinary people made small, careless mistakes, the hero burned down cities by accident. Heroes did not have hobbies. Heroes did not have quiet weekends. The genre simply did not allow for it. The third thing, and the strangest one for modern readers, is that the Greeks actually worshipped these figures. Not as gods exactly, but as a separate category of divine being that occupied the gap between the deathless Olympians and ordinary mortals. The hero, after death, was believed to retain power. His spirit could be petitioned. His tomb became a sacred place. People left offerings of food and wine and small carved objects at the burial sites of famous heroes, and they prayed for help with very specific problems. They asked the dead hero for healing of a sick child. They asked for safe childbirth. They asked for victory in a coming battle, for rain during a drought, for the return of a husband who had been at sea too long. Every city in Greece had at least one such patron hero, often more, and the religious calendar was thick with festivals in their honour. Athens worshipped Theseus, whose supposed bones were eventually retrieved from a distant island and brought home with great ceremony, the kind of event that would today require months of news coverage and at least one parade. Sparta honoured Menelaus and Helen together at a single shrine outside the city, which seems a little awkward given how their marriage was about to go, though the Greeks were always good at letting time soften things. Thebes naturally claimed Heracles. The island of Aegina celebrated Aeacus, the grandfather of Achilles. Each region took pride in its hero the way modern towns take pride in their local sports team, except that the team was several centuries dead and could potentially intercede with the gods on your behalf. There was, the Greeks believed, a certain power that lingered around the bones of these figures. Whole battles were said to have turned because of a hero's intervention from beyond the grave. The Athenians who fought the great battle at Marathon, holding off an enormous invading army with a remarkably smaller force, swore afterwards that they had seen the ghost of Theseus charging at the front of their line in his old bronze armour, leading them forward through the dust. Whether this was a vision, a story circulated to boost morale, or a sincere belief is something historians have argued about for centuries. But the point is that the Athenians believed it, and that belief mattered. The dead were not exactly dead, if you knew the right ones. This idea of the hero as an intermediate being, neither fully god nor fully mortal, did not vanish when Greek civilization gave way to other cultures. It changed shape, but the underlying structure stayed remarkably intact. When the Romans absorbed Greek myth into their own religion, they kept most of the heroes intact, simply translating their names into Latin. Heracles became Hercules, Odysseus became Ulysses. The cult sites continued, the festivals continued, the petitions to dead heroes continued. The Roman Empire spread these practices across half the known world, from the cold edges of Britain to the warm shores of North Africa, until you could find a temple to a Greek hero almost anywhere a Roman road ran. Then Christianity arrived, and a remarkable thing happened. The old hero cults did not so much disappear as transform. Christian saints stepped into the role that heroes had occupied. The structural job was almost identical. A once-living person who had performed great deeds, often suffered greatly, and whose remains now carried power, whose tomb became a place of pilgrimage, who could be petitioned for help with specific problems. Saints, like heroes, often came with troubled pasts. Many of them had been sinners before they became holy, or had wrestled with terrible doubts, or had committed acts they spent the rest of their lives atoning for. The flawed but redeemed shape was familiar. The veneration of relics was familiar. Even the local patron aspect was familiar, since particular saints belonged to particular trades, regions and circumstances, just as Greek heroes had. It was not, the Church would have insisted, the same thing at all, but the human need that hero worship had met was now being met in a different vocabulary, and the older practice slid quietly into the new one. Some of the oldest churches in the Mediterranean were built directly on top of old hero shrines, sometimes incorporating the original stones into their walls. Pilgrims continued to walk to these sites for centuries afterwards, often unaware that the bones they were honouring had once been venerated under a different name. Continuity is one of those quiet forces in history. It tends to go on doing its work no matter what the labels say. The medieval period took the warrior aspect of the Greek hero and built it into something new, the knight. The chivalric code that grew up around armoured horsemen in the centuries after the Roman Empire fell borrowed heavily from older traditions. The knight was supposed to be both a warrior and a moral example, both a fighter and a defender, both rough and refined. Stories told around medieval fires about knights like Lancelot or Roland or El Cid carried the same essential shape as the older stories. A powerful figure marked by destiny, prone to terrible mistakes, capable of extraordinary deeds, often brought down in the end by the very qualities that had raised him up. Lancelot's love for Guinevere, Roland's refusal to call for help until it was far too late. The pattern was older than the armour. In the Renaissance, as writers rediscovered Greek and Roman literature, the hero archetype came back into the light with renewed force. The brooding, complicated central figures of Shakespeare's tragedies, Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, Lear, were close cousins of the Greek heroes, scaled down to recognizably human size but keeping the same essential proportions. A great man undone by his own great flaw. The audience could feel it in their bones because the shape was thousands of years old and somehow still felt true. The Romantic poets of the early 1800s gave us a particular variation called the Byronic hero, named after the poet Lord Byron, who wrote the type and to some extent lived it. He was a brooding, mysterious, attractive figure with a dark past, a man whose suffering made him magnetic and whose flaws made him interesting. He was, in many ways, simply the Greek hero in a velvet jacket. From that branch grew much of modern fiction, the detective with a drinking problem, the reluctant gunslinger, the complicated anti-hero of modern television and film, the superhero whose secret identity hides a wound that will never quite heal. All of them are wearing borrowed clothes from a wardrobe that was first stitched together in the Greek countryside 3,000 years ago. Even now, even in the most recent stories, the shape persists. We still want our heroes to be both more than us, and somehow, recognizably one of us. We still find the perfect, unflawed hero faintly uninteresting, like a meal with no salt. We still want the wounds. We still want the mistakes. We still want the long road of atonement. It turns out that what the Greeks worked out by trial and error in their hero stories was something close to a permanent feature of how the human mind likes to organize the world. Once you have the shape, you cannot forget it. It keeps coming back in new costumes, in new languages, in new centuries. Which is why the next great story, the one we're about to step into, has lasted so long, because almost every hero we have just been thinking about will appear in it. Not as a side character, not in passing, as the main cast. The largest gathering of these mixed-blood, oversized, beautifully flawed people the world had ever seen was about to assemble at the edge of the wine-dark sea for a war that would consume an entire generation and outlive the cities that fought it. And it would all begin, as so many disasters do, at a wedding. Up on Olympus, around the time these heroes were reaching their prime, Zeus had begun to develop a problem. The world was getting crowded. Not with people exactly. The human population was still small by modern standards, but with demigods. The children of the gods. The half-divine offspring whose fathers and mothers walked around with weapons too heavy for ordinary men and tempers too large for ordinary lives. They were everywhere. They were fighting each other. They were starting wars. They were attracting monsters and adventures wherever they went. They were, in their own oversized way, putting more weight on the earth than the earth had been built to carry. Gaia, the great-grandmother of the cosmos, was groaning under it. Zeus, who could see further than anyone, looked at the situation and came to a quiet decision. The age of heroes had to end. Not gradually, not gently. That would take too many centuries. It had to be ended in a single great event. A war so vast and so devastating that the demigod generation would be reduced almost entirely in one stroke. He began to plan. He spoke to Themis, the titaness of divine law, and to Hera, who agreed with the principle if not always with the details. They worked out a kind of arrangement. There would be one final great war among the heroes, fought over a single dramatic cause, drawing in every important kingdom in the Greek world and the kingdoms across the sea on the other side. By the time it was over, the bloodlines would be thinned, the demigods mostly returned to the earth, and the world could begin to settle into a quieter, more recognizably human age. The gods would no longer need to be quite so involved in mortal affairs. Olympus would withdraw a few steps further. The transition from the heroic age to the Iron Age, which the poets would later write so wistfully about, was being engineered behind the scenes by the gods who had decided they wanted their afternoons back. But you cannot start a war out of nothing. You need a spark. The gods had to find a reason, and the reason, as it turned out, would come from a wedding invitation that someone forgot to send. There was a sea nymph named Thetis, one of the daughters of the old sea god Nereus, who was famously beautiful even by the standards of the immortal world. Zeus had wanted her at one point. Poseidon had wanted her too. The two brothers were, in fact, on the verge of an awkward quarrel over which of them would get to her first, when a piece of news reached them that quickly cooled their interest. A prophecy had emerged from Themis herself. The son of Thetis, whoever the father turned out to be, would grow up to be greater than his father. For a mortal man, this would have been an ambiguous compliment, the kind of thing you brag about while secretly worrying. For Zeus and Poseidon, it was a warning siren. They had no intention of producing children who would overthrow them. Their own father had ended that way, and his father before him, and the family tradition was not one they wanted to continue any further. So they both backed off Thetis very quickly and decided, with the practical cruelty of gods, to marry her off to a mortal man instead, where the prophecy could not threaten any of them. The mortal they chose was Peleus, a decent king of a small territory in northern Greece, brave enough to handle a divine bride and not powerful enough to matter much if his son did turn out to be more than him. Peleus had to win Thetis before he could marry her, since she'd not been consulted and was, understandably, not pleased about the arrangement. The way you won a sea nymph against her will, the stories said, was to hold on to her tightly while she transformed into a series of unsettling shapes: water, fire, a lion, a snake, a wave, and not let go until she finally returned to herself, exhausted. Peleus did this, with some divine coaching. Thetis, defeated and resigned, agreed to marry him. It was, by ancient standards, considered a love story. By any modern reading, it is closer to an arranged marriage under coercion. The Greeks were not always squeamish about such distinctions, but the marriage that followed was, in fact, a famously unhappy one, and Thetis would spend much of it back in the sea with her sisters, returning to the human world mostly to check on her son, who, true to the prophecy, would indeed grow up to be greater than his father. His name was Achilles, and we will hear much more about him soon, but that is later. For now, the wedding had to happen. Every god on Olympus was invited. The mountain emptied out for the occasion. Zeus and Hera came, sitting at the head of the long banquet table on Mount Pelion, where the wedding was held. Poseidon brought a gift, a pair of immortal horses for the bridegroom, animals that would later draw Achilles' chariot in the war that had not yet started, though no one realized it then. Apollo and the Muses performed music. Hephaestus had forged the wedding gifts himself in his great underground workshop. The centaurs of Mount Pelion were the catering staff, which is a sentence you do not write very often. It was by all accounts the most beautiful wedding the world had ever seen. Even the trees seemed to be in their best clothes. Almost every god was invited. There was one exception. Eris was the goddess of strife and discord, and her exclusion from the wedding was not an accident. She caused chaos wherever she went. She started arguments at dinner parties. She turned festivals into riots. She had once managed to make two sisters quarrel so badly over a small piece of embroidered cloth that they had not spoken again for 30 years. Inviting Eris to a wedding was like inviting a wasp into a cake shop. The host had, after some discussion, simply left her off the list and hoped she would not notice. Eris noticed. She came to the wedding anyway, of course, but she did not enter the celebration itself. She stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the toasts being made and the music being played, and she reached into her sleeve and brought out a single golden apple. The apple had been worked over by her own hand. Around its bright surface, in delicate letters, ran an inscription declaring that whichever goddess was the most beautiful should take the fruit for herself. She rolled the apple gently into the middle of the assembled gods, then turned and walked away, smiling slightly. By the time the apple came to rest, the trouble had already started. 3 goddesses reached for it at almost the same moment. Hera, queen of the gods, looked at the inscription and saw no reason why it would not refer to her. She was the queen, after all. Beauty came with the title. Athena, the grey-eyed goddess of wisdom and crafts, who was not vain but had a particular pride in her own bearing, saw the apple and felt entitled to it as well. And Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty herself, who had emerged from the sea foam fully formed and had been turning heads ever since, naturally assumed the apple was meant for her. The 3 of them held it together for a moment in the middle of the table, each unwilling to let go, each beginning to glare at the others with the careful precision of immortals who have decided that this, finally, is the hill they are willing to fight on. The wedding came to a stiff and uncomfortable halt. The musicians stopped playing. The conversation died. Everyone looked at Zeus. Zeus, who had decades of experience in being asked to make impossible decisions by his wife, immediately recognized this as a trap with no good answers. Whatever he said, 2 of the 3 goddesses would never forgive him, and one of those 2 was his own queen. He did the only sensible thing. He passed the problem on. He told the 3 of them that the apple could not be properly judged here, in the middle of a wedding, and that the matter needed a neutral third party. He had heard, he said, of a young man tending sheep on the slopes of Mount Ida in the country of Troy. The young man was famously even-handed in his judgments. He had recently, the story said, judged a contest between two bulls, his own and a stranger's, and had awarded the prize to the stranger's bull when it was the better animal, even though he could easily have kept the prize for himself. A young man like that was clearly trustworthy. The three goddesses would go to him, present themselves, and let him decide. The young man's name was Paris. Paris was a prince of Troy, although he himself did not entirely know this yet. His father was Priam, the great king of the city across the sea, an ancient ruler with 50 sons and many daughters, who governed one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms in the known world. Paris's mother was Hecuba, Priam's queen. Before his birth, however, Hecuba had had a strange dream. She dreamed that she gave birth not to a child, but to a flaming torch, which set fire to the city of Troy and burned its walls down to ash. The dream alarmed her. She consulted seers, who agreed that the meaning was clear. This child, when he grew up, would be the destruction of his own city. The royal family, faced with this prophecy, did what royal families in such stories so often do, and tried to outwit fate. The newborn baby was given to a servant and ordered to be left out on the slopes of Mount Ida, the same mountain where the wedding had now produced an apple-shaped catastrophe. The servant, like servants in such stories often do, could not bring himself to actually leave the child, and instead settled the baby in a quiet hollow where a shepherd happened to live. The shepherd found him, took him home, and raised him as his own son. Paris grew up on the mountain, knowing nothing of his birth, herding sheep and goats, and judging the occasional bull contest, becoming the kind of young man who could distinguish himself by being scrupulously fair even when no one was watching. So when the three goddesses appeared before him on the mountainside one afternoon, Paris was, frankly, the wrong person for the job. He was perhaps 20 years old. He had grown up among sheep. He had no experience with the politics of Olympus, no understanding of what was being asked of him, no idea that whichever way he answered would set the world on fire. He saw three breathtakingly beautiful immortal women standing in a meadow, one of them holding a golden apple, all of them watching him intently, and he understood mostly that he was being asked to choose. Then they began to offer him things, because none of them were content to let beauty alone decide. Hera spoke first. She offered him kingship, rule over all the kingdoms of the eastern lands, wealth beyond his imagining, power on a scale that would make his name known forever. He could be an emperor of much of the known world if he chose her. Athena spoke second. She offered him wisdom, the kind of clear-sighted, strategic intelligence that won battles and built lasting reputations. With her favour, he would never make a foolish decision. He would be victorious in every war he ever entered. His name would live in the schools of every century that followed. Aphrodite spoke third. She did not promise empires or victories. She promised him a woman. The most beautiful woman in the world, she said, would belong to him. He would have her love, her companionship, her presence in his life. She named the woman by name. Her name was Helen of Sparta. Paris was 20 years old, raised on a mountain, with no political experience and no military ambition. He chose Aphrodite. He handed her the apple. The two other goddesses, who had not been used to losing anything for centuries, walked away with expressions you would not want directed at you, or at your city. It is worth saying very gently that this was the wrong choice. Hera and Athena were now the enemies of Paris, and not only of Paris but of his entire city. The downfall of Troy was now, in a real sense, already written, before the apple had even stopped rolling. But Paris did not know any of this. He went back to his sheep. The goddesses returned to Olympus. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis concluded somehow awkwardly, and life appeared to go on. Within a few years, however, Paris's true identity was discovered. He won an athletic contest in Troy and was recognized by his sister, the prophet Cassandra, who immediately announced his identity and begged that he be sent away at once for the sake of the city. Priam, who had not seen his exposed son in 20 years and was now overjoyed to discover that the boy had survived, ignored his daughter's warning. Kings have a remarkable ability to ignore the warnings of their daughters when those warnings are inconvenient. He welcomed Paris back into the family. The prophecy of the burning torch was quietly set aside. The young man was made a prince again, given his proper share of the royal household, and treated as a long-lost son. The seers shook their heads. Cassandra, who had been cursed long ago by Apollo to always tell the truth and never be believed, watched the family celebration in silence. Sometime later, Paris began to think about the promise Aphrodite had made him. He had been told he could have the most beautiful woman in the world. He had a goddess on his side. He had nothing to lose. He convinced his father to send him on a diplomatic mission to the kingdom of Sparta on the southern peninsula of Greece, where Helen now lived as the wife of King Menelaus. The journey across the sea was uneventful. Paris arrived at Sparta and was welcomed as a royal guest. Menelaus, who had no reason to suspect his visitor of anything beyond a friendly diplomatic call, hosted him generously. The Spartan king was a straightforward, broad-shouldered man, not particularly subtle, but kind enough, and a steady ruler. He showed Paris the city, fed him at his own table, and introduced him to his wife. Helen was, as promised, the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen. The stories say that men forgot what they were doing in mid-sentence when she walked into a room. Paris, who had been promised this woman by a goddess, was no exception. What followed has been argued about for nearly 3,000 years. The Greeks themselves were never sure how much choice Helen had in the events that came next. Some versions of the story describe her as enchanted by Aphrodite, unable to refuse Paris, helpless in the grip of a power larger than herself. Others describe her as a willing participant, a woman in an unhappy marriage who chose to leave with a handsome younger man. Still others split the difference. Helen herself, in the various poems and plays where she appears, sometimes blames the gods and sometimes blames herself, depending on who is asking and how recent the disaster is. 3,000 years of poets have not been able to settle the question, and we are unlikely to settle it here. What is certain is that an opportunity arose. Menelaus had to leave Sparta for several days, summoned to the funeral of his grandfather on the island of Crete. He left Helen in charge of the household and asked his guest Paris to keep her company in his absence, which sounds in retrospect like one of the worst decisions in the history of hospitality. Within a few days of Menelaus's departure, Paris and Helen were gone. They had packed several chests of Spartan treasure for the journey, boarded Paris's ship and sailed for Troy with a fair wind. They left in such a hurry that the household servants did not realize the queen was gone until the next morning, when she did not come to breakfast. When Menelaus returned home and discovered what had happened, his rage was, by all accounts, of an unusual quality. He was not a man who flew into easy tempers, which made his anger when it came all the more dangerous. He immediately sent word to his older brother Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, the most powerful ruler in Greece, and the closest thing the scattered Greek kingdoms had to a high king. Agamemnon, who had married Helen's sister Clytemnestra, and was therefore family in a complicated overlapping way, understood at once that this was not an insult that could be ignored. A queen had been taken, treasure had been stolen, a guest had violated the most fundamental laws of hospitality. The honour of Sparta and of Mycenae and of all the kingdoms of Greece had been struck at, and someone was going to pay for it. But how could Agamemnon raise the army he would need? Greece in those days was not a single nation. It was a patchwork of independent kingdoms, large and small, each with its own king and its own interests, each likely to roll its eyes at any request to drop its own concerns and sail east to recover one man's runaway wife. Persuading them all to come, in numbers large enough to attack a city as well defended as Troy, would have been almost impossible, except for one thing: the oath. Years earlier, before Helen had been married to anyone, every prince and king in the Greek world had wanted to marry her. They had gathered at Sparta in a great crowd, each presenting his case, each bringing his bridal gifts, each willing to fight the others for her hand. The situation had been on the edge of becoming a war all on its own, since Helen's father, Tyndareus, knew that whichever suitor he chose, the others would be furious and might well attack his kingdom in revenge. Into this knot of impossible diplomacy had walked a younger king, a clever man from a small rocky island in the western sea called Odysseus. He had come as a suitor himself, but he had also come with a particular reputation for solving problems through cleverness rather than force. He had taken Tyndareus aside and proposed a solution. Before Helen chose her husband, Odysseus said, all the suitors should be required to swear a solemn oath. They should swear that whichever of them Helen chose, the rest would accept the decision peacefully. And more than that, they should swear that if anyone ever, at any time in the future, took Helen from her chosen husband by any means, all of the suitors would come to her husband's aid and help recover her, with whatever forces they could muster. Tyndareus had liked the idea. The suitors, knowing they were unlikely to be chosen anyway and wanting to keep their own kingdoms intact, had all agreed. They had sworn the oath together, hand on a sacrificial offering, in the proper ancient form. Then Helen had chosen Menelaus. The other suitors had gone home. The oath had been filed away in everyone's memory and largely forgotten about for years. Odysseus, his work done, had been rewarded for his cleverness with the hand of Helen's quieter cousin Penelope, whom he had actually wanted to marry all along. He had sailed home to his small rocky island and built a quiet life there with his bride, raising a young son and tending olive trees and probably hoping the rest of the world would forget about him. Now, years later, the oath was about to be called in. Agamemnon sent messengers to every kingdom that had taken part in the original swearing. He reminded them of the words they had spoken. He invoked the binding force of the ancient oath. He asked them to assemble at the Bay of Aulis, on the eastern coast of Greece, with their ships and their warriors, to sail east and recover Helen from Troy. One by one, kingdom by kingdom, the answers came back. They would come. They had sworn. The oath could not be unmade. The greatest gathering of heroes the world had ever seen began to assemble at the edge of the sea. From every corner of Greece they came, old kings who had once been suitors, young warriors who had inherited the obligation from their fathers when the original swearers had grown too old to travel, princes and lords and chieftains, with their ships and their horses and their long-tempered hopes of glory. They came reluctantly in many cases. They came knowing that the war would not be easy and that not all of them would come home. But they came. The oath demanded it. And somewhere up on Olympus, Zeus watched the ships gathering in the bay and quietly noted that the first stage of his long-laid plan was proceeding more or less on schedule. Among the ships gathering in that crowded bay, two figures in particular were missing, figures whose absence the rest of the assembled army would soon find itself unable to do without. The first was a man so reluctant to go to war that he was about to pretend to lose his mind in order to avoid it. The second was a boy who had been hidden away by his mother on a distant island, dressed in women's clothes among a king's daughters, because a prophecy said that he would never come back alive from Troy if he ever went. Their stories, and the way the army would have to drag both of them out of hiding before it could sail, belonged to the next part of the night. For now the ships were gathering. The sails were being mended, the shields were being polished, and the spears were being sharpened in long, quiet rows by the firelight. The spark struck by Eris's apple had become a small, steady flame, and that flame was about to become a fire that would burn for 10 long years and reduce one of the great cities of the ancient world to a memory. The Trojan War was beginning. The first of those two missing heroes lived on a small rocky island called Ithaca, on the western edge of the Greek world. Odysseus had built himself the quiet life he had always wanted there. He had a wife he loved, a baby son not yet a year old, an aging father living nearby, olive groves on the hillsides, fishing boats in the harbour, and a herdsman or two who could be trusted to handle the practical business of the kingdom, while their king sat under a fig tree and thought his long, careful thoughts. He had wanted nothing more from the world than this. He had heard about the gathering at Aulis. He had no intention of going. The trouble was that he had personally invented the oath that was now being used to drag every king in Greece into the war. He could hardly claim that the oath did not apply to him, since he had written it himself. When the messengers arrived at Ithaca to call him to the army, Odysseus saw them coming up the road from the harbour and thought quickly. He could not refuse outright. He needed an excuse the messengers would accept and would carry back, so he chose the oldest excuse in the book. He decided to pretend to be mad. When the messengers arrived at his door, they were told that the king was, unfortunately, no longer himself. They were taken out to a field behind the palace, where they saw a sight that left them speechless. Odysseus was there, dressed in rough peasant clothes, ploughing his field with a strange team that yoked an ox to a donkey, two animals that would never naturally walk together at the same speed, and were currently making the plough weave drunkenly across the soil. Worse, he was sowing the field not with grain, but with salt, scattering it in handfuls behind the plough, as though he had forgotten what farming actually was. He sang strange songs as he walked. He did not seem to recognize his guests. For a moment the messengers were ready to turn around and report that Odysseus had unfortunately lost his mind. But one of them was no fool. His name was Palamedes, and he was famously clever in his own right, the inventor of certain games and counting systems, the kind of man who solved a problem by approaching it from an unexpected angle. Palamedes watched Odysseus plough for a few minutes and then walked over to the cradle where the baby Telemachus was sleeping in the shade. He lifted the child gently and walked out into the field, and he laid the baby on the soil directly in the path of the oncoming plough. Odysseus, ploughing his pretended madness across the field, looked up at exactly the right moment, swerved the plough sharply to one side, and lifted the baby out of the way without a thought. The act of paternal reflex took less than a second. It was also, of course, completely incompatible with the madness he had been claiming. Palamedes smiled politely. Odysseus, caught and outthought by a man who in any other situation he would probably have outsmarted himself, sighed and dropped the act. He kissed his son. He went into the house and put on his armour. He embraced his wife, Penelope, and promised her he would come home, though both of them suspected they did not really know when. He boarded a ship the next morning. He would eventually get his revenge on Palamedes for that little trick at the plough, but that is a side story for another time, and not a pretty one. The second missing hero was much younger, less than 15 years old at this point, though aging at the strange accelerated pace of demigods, which made him roughly the equivalent of a young adult in mortal terms. His name was Achilles. He was the son of the marriage we have already heard about, the mortal king Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, and as expected he had grown up to be greater than his father. His mother knew it. She had heard the prophecy that hung over him. Achilles could choose, the prophecy said, between two fates. He could stay home in his father's kingdom, marry, raise children, live a long and quiet life, and be forgotten within a generation. Or he could go to Troy, where he would perform deeds that would be remembered as long as humans told stories to each other, and he would die there, young, before his hair had even begun to grey. Thetis knew which fate her son would choose if anyone asked him. He was already obsessed with weapons and chariot racing and the kind of glory that boys his age tend to be obsessed with. So she did the only thing a mother in her position could think to do. She did not ask him. She hid him. She took him secretly across the sea to the small kingdom of Skyros, ruled by an old friend of hers, King Lycomedes, who had several daughters around her son's age. She dressed Achilles in girls' clothes and gave him a girl's name and sent him to live in the women's quarters of the palace with the king's daughters. The plan, frankly, was thin. Achilles was a remarkably good-looking boy who was about to start becoming a remarkably good-looking young man. He would not pass as a girl for long. But Thetis hoped he would pass long enough. Long enough for the army at Aulis to sail without him. Long enough for the war to start without him. Long enough for the prophecy to be cheated by simple absence. She nearly pulled it off. Achilles lived among the daughters of King Lycomedes for some years, taking the name Pyrrha, learning the things they learned, becoming close to them in the way young people who live together inevitably do. He fell in love with one of the king's daughters, a young woman named Idamia, and she with him. The secret of his real identity could not be kept entirely from her, naturally, and the two of them had a son together in those quiet years. The boy was named Pyrrhus, who would later play his own role in the war his father was trying to avoid. But the army at Aulis needed Achilles. The seers had told them so. There was a prophecy circulating among the Greek leaders, given by an old wise man named Calchas, that Troy could not be taken without him. They could besiege the city for 100 years and still leave defeated if Achilles were not in their ranks. This was inconvenient, since no one knew where Achilles was. Thetis had hidden him too well. It was Odysseus, of course, who figured out where to look. He had a way of solving these problems through careful thought rather than brute force, which was, after all, exactly the kind of skill that had landed him in his own current predicament. He had heard the rumours about Skyros. He sailed there with a small group of warriors, dressed himself as a peddler, and entered the palace claiming to have wares to sell to the king's daughters. He laid out his goods in the women's quarters, jewellery, dyed cloth, perfumes, mirrors, and, tucked away among the soft pretty things, a single sword and a small round shield. He pretended not to notice the second category. He simply set the goods out and waited. The daughters of Lycomedes crowded around the jewellery and the cloth, exclaiming and touching and trying things on. One of them, however, picked up the sword. She tested its weight in her hand. She turned the blade in the light. She picked up the shield too, slipped her arm into the straps, and tried a practice stance with the kind of unconscious familiarity that comes from years of training. Odysseus had what he needed. He politely informed Pyrrha that the army was waiting. Achilles, because the daughter holding the sword was of course Achilles, looked up, looked at his own hand on the weapon, sighed the same sigh Odysseus had sighed in his field, and went to put on the armour his mother had not been able to keep from him forever. He kissed Deidamia goodbye. He met his small son. He sailed for Aulis with Odysseus, leaving Skyros behind. He never went back. With both heroes finally accounted for, the army at Aulis was complete. Agamemnon counted the ships and reportedly came up with a number close to 1,000, the famous 1,000 ships, although ancient sources varied on the exact count, and the figure was probably rounded for poetic convenience. Each kingdom had contributed its share. The largest contingents came from the most powerful kings, Agamemnon himself with 100 ships from Mycenae, his brother Menelaus with 60 from Sparta, Nestor, the old wise king, with 90 from Pylos, who could remember when most of these young captains had been children, Odysseus with 12 from Ithaca, Achilles with 50 of the elite warriors called Myrmidons from his father's kingdom in the north. Many more came from every other corner of Greece. Notable warriors included Ajax the giant, son of Telamon, who was second only to Achilles in the army's fighting strength, Diomedes, the bold young king of Argos, Calchas the prophet, who had given them the prophecies and would give them more, the doctor Machaon and his brother Podalirius, sons of the great healer Asclepius. The army was, by the standards of its time, enormous. The Bay of Aulis could barely contain it. The fleet sailed. It did not, however, go smoothly. The Greeks were not, by training, an experienced naval force. They knew their local waters, but the eastern Mediterranean was a different proposition entirely. The fleet was struck by a powerful storm a few days out from Aulis and scattered across the sea. Ships made landfall wherever they could find safe harbour. When the storm cleared and the captains began to reassemble, they discovered that they had landed in the wrong country. They were not at Troy. They were on the coast of a kingdom called Mysia, well to the south, ruled by a king named Telephus, who had himself married into the Trojan royal family. The Greeks, not knowing where they were, began to attack the local population, assuming they had reached Troy at last. The local population fought back with the particular vigour of people who have suddenly been invaded by complete strangers for no obvious reason. There was a significant battle. By the time everyone realised that the Greeks had attacked the wrong country, Telephus had been wounded in the leg by Achilles, and the misunderstanding had become an international incident. The army withdrew. The fleet limped home to its various kingdoms, embarrassed and bedraggled and unsure what to do next. There was no central command structure that could simply reassemble them on the spot. They went home to their own ports, dispersed across Greece, and the war that had been about to begin had, instead, fizzled into a humiliating mess. For the next 8 years, the Greek kings communicated with each other through messengers and through occasional gatherings, slowly putting together the next attempt. Telephus, the wounded king of Mysia, eventually consulted an oracle, and was told that the wound on his leg would only ever heal when touched by the same weapon that had inflicted it. So Telephus travelled to Greece himself, found Achilles, was reconciled with him. The Greeks were prepared to be friendly to a man who held information they needed, and Telephus, in exchange for being healed, told them the precise route to Troy and the best season to sail. The blade was rubbed gently against his wound. The wound closed. The Greeks now had the information they had lacked. Old men had grown older during those 8 years. Young men had grown into their full strength. Some who had been at the first muster had died of ordinary illnesses in the meantime. And their sons had inherited the obligation. New ships had been built to replace the ones lost in the storm. Provisions were stockpiled with more care this time. When the fleet gathered for the second time at Aulis, it was even larger than before. But there was a new problem. The winds, suspiciously, would not turn. For weeks the ships sat in the harbour. The wind blew from the wrong direction, day after day, refusing to shift. The army grew restless. Food began to run short. Tempers, already high in an enormous gathering of competitive warriors, began to fray. The bards composed gloomy songs. Soldiers fought each other for entertainment and grew bored even of that. Calchas the prophet was finally consulted. What was wrong with the winds? Calchas gave Agamemnon an answer the king did not want to hear. Artemis, the huntress goddess, was angry with the army's commander. Agamemnon had recently, in some versions of the story, harmed a deer in a grove sacred to Artemis, and he had then made a boast about being a better hunter than the goddess herself, which is the kind of comment that costs you. In other versions there was no such incident, and Artemis was simply angry on principle, perhaps remembering the apple. Either way, the goddess had decided that the army would not sail until a particular price was paid. The price was the king's eldest daughter, Iphigenia. Artemis demanded her, brought to the altar at Aulis. The story that follows has been argued over for as long as any in Greek myth, and the Greeks themselves told it many different ways. In some versions, Agamemnon refused, was overruled by the army, and was forced into the decision against his will. In others, he agreed too quickly, prioritizing his command over his fatherhood, and his wife Clytemnestra never forgave him afterwards. In still others, he tricked Iphigenia into coming to Aulis under the pretext that she was to be married to Achilles, which produced an extra layer of unpleasantness when she arrived and discovered the truth, and Achilles himself, when he learned what was happening in his name, was reportedly furious about it. In all versions, the moment at the altar was terrible, but in many versions, including the kindest ones the Greeks told themselves, the story does not end where it appears to end. At the last possible moment, just as the priest was about to perform the rite, Artemis herself intervened. She wrapped Iphigenia in a soft white cloud, lifted her gently from the altar, and replaced her with a young deer, which was sacrificed instead. Iphigenia was carried away to the far northern lands of the Taurians, where she lived for many years as a priestess of Artemis, eventually being reunited with her brother Orestes long after the war was over. It is one of those stories that the Greeks circled back to and tried to soften, perhaps because the original was simply too painful to live with. The deer substitution version became the most widely known. Whether anyone at the time genuinely believed it, or whether it was a later poetic mercy, we will never know. Whatever happened on the altar, the winds changed within the hour. The fleet finally sailed. 1,000 ships, or close to it, moved out of the bay at Aulis with their sails filling and their oars beating, and the long voyage toward Troy began at last. The fleet that finally landed on the shores of Troy was the largest seaborne invasion the ancient world had ever seen. The beach was wide. The walls of Troy rose in the distance far back from the shore with the plain of the river Scamander between them. Smoke rose from the city's many hearth fires. Towers stood at every gate. The walls themselves, it was said, had been built long ago by Apollo and Poseidon for an earlier king, and they were said to be unbreachable by ordinary means. Looking up at them from the beach, the Greek soldiers must have understood for the first time exactly what they had agreed to. The city was not going to fall easily. The city was not going to fall at all, unless something extraordinary happened. Before they even fully landed, the war claimed its first hero. There was an old prophecy that said the first Greek warrior to set foot on Trojan soil would also be the first to die there. Every captain had heard it. Every captain hesitated as the ships ground onto the sand. Nobody wanted to step off first. The army stood frozen on its own decks for several long moments, waiting for someone else to volunteer. Eventually one of them did. His name was Protesilaus, a young king of a small territory in northern Greece, and he had heard the prophecy and decided it did not matter. He had been married only days before the fleet sailed. He had a young wife waiting at home. He could have stayed back. Instead, he stepped off the prow of his ship onto the sand of Troy, sword in hand, and he fell in the first skirmish of the day, struck down by Hector, the eldest son of King Priam and the greatest warrior of the Trojan side. He was the war's first casualty. He would not be the last. His widow, in the saddest version of the story, could not bear to live without him, and her grief became one of the small tragedies inside the larger tragedy of the war. The Greeks established their camp along the beach, drew their ships up onto the sand, and dug in for what they expected to be a short campaign. It turned out to be anything but. Troy was simply too well built to take quickly. The walls were too high to scale. The gates were too thick to break. The defenders were too numerous and too well led. King Priam had 50 sons of his own, many of them grown warriors, and the city was supported by allies from across the surrounding region. Lycians, Dardanians, Carians, Mysians, Phrygians, all sending troops to defend their neighbour against a foreign army that had, after all, arrived to take a single woman home. Year after year passed. The Greeks raided the towns and islands around Troy, building up their wealth in plunder and slowly grinding down the Trojan economy by destroying the surrounding countryside. They attacked Troy directly when they could. The Trojans counterattacked when they could. The Greek camp held. The Trojan walls held. It became, slowly, the most exhausting kind of war. Not a series of dramatic battles, but a long stalemate, with raids and skirmishes and counter-raids and small victories and small defeats, none of them decisive, none of them bringing the end any closer. The men aged on both sides. The youngest soldiers who had sailed from Greece grew thick beards by their 2nd year, and lines around their eyes by their 5th. They built more permanent shelters. They built small workshops to repair their armour. They traded with passing merchants who had figured out that there was money to be made selling supplies to a long siege, and the camp gradually acquired the slightly worn quality of a town that had been a tent city for too long. By the 7th or 8th year, some of them were probably no longer entirely sure what they were fighting for, except that the alternative was to go home defeated, and going home defeated was not an option any of them could live with. Inside the city the years passed differently, but no more easily. Helen herself, in the various poems and plays where she appears, was often shown standing on the walls of Troy, looking down at the Greek camp on the beach. She's said to have known many of the Greek warriors by name, and to have pointed them out to Priam from the tower above the main gate, identifying the men who had once courted her in Sparta a lifetime ago. Whether she regretted what had happened, or had grown numb to it, or quietly hoped for one ending over the other, the poets disagreed. The Trojans treated her, in most accounts, with surprising kindness, considering she was the cause of their ongoing catastrophe. Priam in particular was said to be gentle with her, blaming the gods rather than the woman they had used as their instrument. Inside Troy, life still went on. Markets opened, children were born, festivals were held when the season called for them, though the music was sometimes thin and the dancers tired. On both sides, individual warriors had their moments of glory, and the bards collected them. Diomedes, the young king of Argos, fought so brilliantly in one stretch of the war that he reportedly wounded Aphrodite herself when she came down to protect her son, Aeneas, a Trojan prince, in the middle of a battle. The goddess fled back to Olympus, weeping more from shock than from any real pain. Ajax the giant held the Greek line single-handedly during one of the worst Trojan attacks on the ships, standing on the deck of a beached vessel and throwing back every Trojan who tried to set fire to it, until his great shield was so weighed down with embedded spears that he could barely lift it. The Trojan champion Sarpedon, a son of Zeus himself, led wave after wave of attack on the Greek wall and fell in single combat against Patroclus. The war was, in other words, full of heroes doing heroic things. It just was not full of progress. In the 10th year of the war, however, the famous quarrel began. The Greeks had captured, during one of their raids on a nearby town, a young woman named Briseis. According to the customs of the time, she'd been awarded as a prize of war to Achilles. The same raid had also produced another young woman, Chryseis, who had been awarded to Agamemnon. Both warriors had taken their prizes back to camp. Both situations would now combine to produce the catastrophe at the heart of the great poem that Homer would later compose about this war. Chryseis, as it turned out, was the daughter of a priest of Apollo. Her father came to the Greek camp alone, an old man carrying his priestly staff, and he begged Agamemnon to return his daughter. He offered a generous ransom. He spoke gently. He invoked the god he served. Agamemnon, who could have taken the ransom and built goodwill with both the local priesthood and the gods, instead refused harshly and sent the old man away with insults. The priest walked home and prayed to Apollo. Apollo heard. For 9 days a plague swept through the Greek camp. Men sickened in their tents. Horses and dogs died in their pens. The fires that the Greeks built to burn the dead burned constantly, day and night. Achilles eventually called the army together and demanded to know what had caused this. Calchas the prophet, who was reluctant to answer because he knew the answer would offend the king, finally explained that it was Agamemnon's refusal to return the priest's daughter. Agamemnon would have to give her back. Agamemnon, furious at being publicly forced into a humiliating climb-down, agreed to return Chryseis, but then announced that, in compensation for his lost prize, he would take Briseis from Achilles. Achilles drew his sword. Athena, invisible to everyone else, appeared behind him and laid a hand on his shoulder, telling him not to kill the king. He sheathed his sword, but the damage had been done. Achilles withdrew from the war. He walked back to his ships, gathered his myrmidons around him, and announced that they would not fight again until Agamemnon apologized. Agamemnon, who was even more stubborn than he was foolish, refused to apologize. The Greek army was now missing its greatest warrior, and everyone on both sides knew it within hours. Achilles went to the shore alone and called for his mother. Thetis rose out of the sea and listened to his grief, and then she went up to Olympus and pleaded with Zeus to favour the Trojans, just for a little while, just enough to make the Greeks regret the insult to her son. Zeus, who owed Thetis a favour from a long-ago crisis on Olympus, agreed reluctantly. The tide of the war began to turn against the Greeks. In the same period, an attempt was made to end the war without further bloodshed. Both armies, exhausted by the long stalemate, agreed to a single duel between Paris, who had started the war by taking Helen, and Menelaus, whose wife had been taken. Whichever of them won would keep Helen, and the war would end. It was a sensible proposal, the kind of proposal that 10 years earlier might have actually worked. The two armies stood and watched as the two men faced each other in the open space between them. Menelaus had been waiting for this moment for a decade. He was older now, his beard greyer, but his anger had not cooled. He attacked first. Paris, who was a fine archer but not a great close combat fighter, tried to defend himself but was clearly outmatched. Within minutes Menelaus had the upper hand and was about to finish the duel decisively, when Aphrodite, watching from above, wrapped Paris in a cloud and lifted him away to safety inside the walls of Troy. Menelaus was left standing alone in the centre of the field, his sword in his hand looking at empty air where his enemy had been. The duel was inconclusive. The truce was broken. The war resumed. Without Achilles, the Greeks began to lose ground. Hector led the Trojans in a series of devastating attacks. They pushed the Greeks back to the beach. They were close to setting fire to the Greek ships and ending the war by simply burning the invaders' way home. The Greek captains begged Achilles to return. He refused. But Achilles had a friend, his closest companion since boyhood, a young man named Patroclus. Patroclus had grown up in Achilles' father's household after being sent there in disgrace from his own family as a child, and the two of them had been inseparable for as long as anyone could remember. They had trained together, fought together, lived together, and Patroclus was the one person in the world Achilles trusted entirely. As the Greek defeat grew worse, Patroclus could not bear it. He went to Achilles and begged for permission to lead the Myrmidons into battle himself. If Achilles would not fight, then at least let Patroclus fight in his place. And, Patroclus added, let him wear Achilles' armour, so that the Trojans would think the great hero had returned and would lose heart. Achilles, with deep misgivings, agreed. He warned Patroclus to drive the Trojans back from the ships and then return immediately. No pursuit, no attempt to reach the city walls, no glory-seeking. Patroclus promised. He did not keep the promise. Wearing the armour of Achilles, Patroclus led the Myrmidons into battle and threw the Trojans back from the ships with such force that the entire army wavered. Carried away by the moment, by the heat of his first major battle, Patroclus pursued the retreating Trojans all the way to the walls of Troy themselves. There he met Hector. The two of them fought. Hector, with the help of Apollo, who had not forgiven the Greeks for the original insult to his priest, struck Patroclus down and stripped him of the borrowed armour. The body was eventually recovered by the Greeks, but the armour was gone, and Patroclus was gone with it. The news reached Achilles in the camp. He had not cried during the entire war. He cried then. The grief and rage that came over him at that moment changed him entirely. He no longer cared about Agamemnon's insult. He no longer cared about Briseis or Chryseis or any of the petty quarrels of kings. He cared only about avenging Patroclus. Thetis came up from the sea one more time and embraced her son, and warned him that if he went into battle now, his own death would follow Hector's within days. The prophecy that had hung over him since birth was about to come due at last. Achilles did not hesitate. He chose his death. His mother brought him new armour. She went to Hephaestus, the smith god, and asked him to forge a complete new set for her son, the most magnificent armour ever made. The shield alone was a work of art that the poets would describe for centuries, decorated with images of the entire world, of cities and farms and weddings and harvests and dances, the whole of human life captured in concentric rings around the central boss. It was, the Greeks said, a portrait of everything Achilles was about to give up. Hephaestus worked through one long night, and by morning the armour was ready. Achilles put it on. He marched out onto the plain. The Trojans, seeing him coming, fled back toward their city. Achilles cut a path through their ranks. He pushed them back across the plain. The Trojan army broke and ran. They poured back through the gates of the city in a panic, all of them except one. Hector stayed outside the walls, alone, knowing what was coming. His parents called to him from the gate, begging him to come in. He could not. He had brought down Achilles' dearest friend. He had to face what came of that. The two warriors faced each other in the open ground before Troy. They circled the walls of the city 3 times before they finally came to close combat. Athena, who had not forgotten the apple, helped Achilles by appearing to Hector in a disguise and convincing him to stop and fight. Hector turned, saw Achilles bearing down on him, and understood at the last moment that he had been tricked. He fought bravely. He fell bravely. Achilles defeated him in front of the watching walls of his own city, and his father and mother watched from the towers above. What followed was the worst of Achilles. In his grief and rage he treated Hector's body with a cruelty that even his fellow Greeks found disturbing. For days he refused to release it for proper burial, denying the Trojans the chance to grieve. The gods themselves grew concerned. Apollo protected the body from harm. Zeus eventually intervened. It was Priam himself who finally brought the matter to an end. The old king of Troy, with the help of Hermes who guided him through the Greek camp invisibly, came alone to Achilles' tent in the dead of night. The journey itself was extraordinary. An old king walking through the lines of his enemy by night, slipping past sentries and sleeping warriors, every step risking his own life, all to reach the one man on earth he most had reason to hate. He knelt at the feet of the man who had killed his son. He kissed the hands that had done it. He begged for his son's body so that he could bury him properly. It was one of the most extraordinary moments in all of Greek literature. Achilles, who had been beyond reasoning for days, looked at this old man kneeling before him and saw for the first time something other than his own grief. He saw a father. He thought of his own father, Peleus, alone in his kingdom, waiting for a son who would never come home. He thought of Patroclus. He thought of Hector. He thought of what they all shared, which was the simple fact of mortality, of being men with fathers and sons and grief and love. He raised Priam up. He sat the old king down. They ate together. They wept together. Then he gave him his son's body, washed and wrapped properly, and granted a truce of 12 days so that the Trojans could mourn and bury their prince. Priam returned to the city with Hector's body. The truce held. The Trojans mourned. The funeral was performed with all the honours a city could pay. Then the war resumed. Achilles did not have long after that. The prophecy his mother had warned him about caught up with him within days, just as she had said it would. The detail of how it happened has come down to us in several versions, but the most famous is this. Achilles was attacking the city itself, fighting fiercely at the gates, and Paris, the same Paris who had started the whole war, the one who had ducked away from Menelaus in the duel, took up his bow on the wall above. Paris was a famously good archer, even if he was a famously bad fighter at close quarters. He aimed at Achilles. The arrow flew straight and true. It struck Achilles in the heel. It should have been a minor wound, except for one thing. When Achilles had been a baby, his mother Thetis had tried to make him immortal, the way mothers of demigods sometimes tried with their half-mortal children. She had dipped him in the river Styx, the dark river of the underworld, whose waters could grant invulnerability to anyone who fully bathed in them. But she had held him by his heel, and her grip had covered that one small spot, so that the water of the river had touched every part of him except where her fingers were. The heel had remained mortal. Paris's arrow had found, by chance or by Apollo's careful guidance, the only vulnerable point on the greatest warrior in the world. Achilles fell at the gates of Troy. The Greek army in shock fought its way through fierce Trojan resistance to recover his body and his armour from the field. Both were eventually brought back to the Greek camp, where Achilles was given the most magnificent funeral the war had seen, attended by the Muses themselves, who came down from Olympus to sing for him in their ninefold voice. The mourning lasted 17 days. Greek and Trojan, by all accounts, paused their fighting during that time, because even the enemy understood what had passed. The poets later said that Thetis rose from the sea with all her sister nymphs and stood weeping along the shoreline, and that the sky above the funeral pyre was full of strange lights for the whole of one long night. His armour, the shield with all the world engraved on it included, would later become the source of yet another bitter quarrel among the surviving Greek heroes, and a worthy story of its own, one that would end with the second greatest warrior in the army, Ajax the giant, also lost to the war in his own way. His ashes were mingled with those of Patroclus, as he had asked long before, and the two of them were buried together under a great mound on the shore. The mound still stands. or at least a mound is still pointed out to visitors on that coast, and travellers from every century since have made the pilgrimage to it to leave small offerings and to wonder. The greatest warrior in the world was gone. The war was, somehow, no closer to ending than it had been 10 long years before. The walls of Troy still stood, unbroken and apparently unbreakable. The Greeks still camped along the beach, weary and grieving and not at all closer to the victory they had been promised. The thing that would finally bring the city down was about to come from a direction no one had yet thought of. And it would be invented, of course, by the same clever man from a small rocky island who had, 20 years earlier, tried so very hard not to come to this war at all. The man on the small rocky island had grown tired. By this point in the war, Odysseus had been away from home for more than 10 years, and he had begun to do the arithmetic that nobody around him wanted to do. If the war went on at this pace forever, he would never see Penelope again. He would never see his son Telemachus grow into a man. He would never sit again under the fig tree behind his house and watch the light fall on the bay. So he applied his mind, as he had once applied it to the problem of the oath itself, and he set himself to the task of finding a way to end the war. The walls of Troy, as we have already heard often enough, were impossible to breach by force. Whatever ended this war was not going to be a frontal assault. It was going to be a trick, and the trick was going to have to be the cleverest thing anyone had ever thought of, because the Trojans had been alert and watching for 10 full years. They were not going to fall for anything obvious. They had, in fact, become rather good at spotting Greek schemes, the way people who have lived next to a noisy neighbour for a decade become quite good at predicting which knocks at the door to answer. The first half of Odysseus's plan was the easier part. He needed to convince the Trojans that the Greeks had given up. They had to truly believe it, not as a possibility but as a fact. So he proposed that the entire Greek army withdraw. Not pretend to withdraw, actually withdraw. Every ship, every soldier, every tent struck and every horse loaded and every banner taken down. The whole army would sail away from the beach in plain sight, vanish over the horizon, and leave Troy looking out at an empty stretch of sand where 10 years of camp had stood. The Trojans needed to walk down to that beach and see nothing but seagulls and bare patches of grass. The second half of the plan was the hard part, because naturally the army would not actually be going home. It would sail only a short distance to a hidden cove on the small island of Tenedos just offshore, where the ships would be invisible from the walls. There they would wait, ready to come back the moment they were needed. What would do the actual work of taking the city, while the army waited offshore, was a single object left behind on the empty beach. An object so strange, so striking, so apparently sacred that the Trojans would not be able to resist it. A horse! An enormous wooden horse taller than the city gates, hollow inside with room enough hidden in its belly for several dozen of the most elite Greek warriors. Odysseus would be one of them. Menelaus would be another. Diomedes, Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles who had come to the war after his father's death. The long-suffering archer Philoctetes, who had been retrieved from his lonely island exile only recently, and several others. The cream of what was left of the Greek army. They would climb inside the horse the night before the rest of the army sailed, hidden away in the dark, breathing quietly, waiting. The Greeks had a craftsman with them named Epius, son of Panopeus, a man of remarkable skill with timber. He was not, by any account, a great warrior. He was actually known among the army for being one of the better runners, but a fairly mediocre fighter in close combat, the kind of man who had been useful in a long siege without ever being central to any of its dramatic moments. But he had a gift for woodwork that bordered on the miraculous. Athena herself, the stories said, gave him designs for the great wooden creature, and worked through his hands as he assembled it. Whatever the source of the inspiration, the horse went up over the course of 3 days, built from timbers cut on Mount Ida, the same mountain where Paris had once judged that fateful contest of 3 goddesses. The wood, in other words, came from the very mountain where the trouble had started. The Greeks could not have asked for better symbolism if they had hired a poet to arrange it. When the horse was finished, it stood as tall as a small tower. Its body was a great hollow chamber large enough to hold 30 armed men. Its eyes were made of dark stone polished to a soft gleam. Its mane was carved in long curling lines. A trapdoor was concealed in the belly, designed to swing down silently on greased hinges. An inscription was cut into the horse's side declaring it an offering to the goddess Athena from the departing Greek army. in apology for 10 years of war and as a prayer for safe passage home. The chosen warriors climbed inside on the appointed night. They settled themselves on benches built into the horse's interior. They put down their shields and rested their swords across their knees. They tried to make themselves comfortable, knowing they might have to remain silent inside that wooden belly for many hours, perhaps even an entire day, with no possibility of stretching, no possibility of speaking, and no possibility of doing anything about the man next to them if he happened to snore. Outside, the rest of the Greek army was striking camp. Tents came down, cooking fires were buried, horses were loaded, ships were launched. By dawn, the beach that had been a Greek camp for a decade looked as though no one had ever been there at all, except for the strange, enormous wooden horse standing alone on the sand, and the broken pottery and bare patches of trampled grass that any departing army leaves behind. But there was one Greek soldier still left on the beach. His name was Sinon, and he was a cousin of Odysseus, chosen for this part of the plan because he was a good actor and could be trusted with the most important lie of the entire war. As the Greek ships disappeared over the horizon, Sinon stayed behind. He tore his own clothes. He smeared dirt on his face. He bound his own hands loosely with cord. He sat down by the horse and waited. The Trojans came out cautiously. They had been watching all night from the walls. They had seen the ships sailing away. They could hardly believe what they were seeing. After 10 years of siege, the Greeks had simply gone. Was it really over? They came out in small groups at first, then in larger crowds, descending to the beach to see for themselves. They walked through the abandoned camp, touching the cold ashes of the fire pits, picking up small abandoned objects, marvelling at the silence of a place that had been so loud for so long. They examined the great wooden horse. They argued among themselves about what it meant, and they found Sinon. Sinon, when discovered, played his part beautifully. He claimed to be a Greek deserter who had escaped his own army's wrath. He claimed that the Greeks, before sailing, had nearly used him as part of the right they needed for favourable winds, a story designed to remind the Trojans uncomfortably of certain rumours about Aulis. He told them the horse was an offering to Athena, built deliberately enormous so that the Trojans could not bring it inside their city. If the horse were brought inside the walls, Sinon said, then Troy would become invincible. The Greeks had built it large precisely so that no one could ever do that, which meant, of course, that the smartest thing the Trojans could do was the very thing the Greeks supposedly did not want them to do. The Trojans, who had perhaps had a little wine to celebrate the apparent end of the war, found this story entirely convincing. It flattered them. It made the Greeks look foolish. It promised them protection forever. It worked, in other words, exactly as Odysseus had calculated it would work. There were, however, two voices on the Trojan side who tried to warn against this. The first was Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, who came down to the beach and looked at the horse with deep suspicion. He warned his fellow Trojans not to trust any gift left behind by their enemies. He even threw a spear at the horse's side to make his point, and the warriors hidden inside felt the spear point quiver through the wood right beside their ears. One of them might even have made a small involuntary sound, which on a quieter day might have given the whole plan away. But almost immediately afterwards, two enormous serpents rose out of the waves and came ashore, and Lacon and his sons were lost to them in a manner so unsettling that we will not dwell on it. The Trojans, watching this, interpreted the omen as proof that Laocoon had offended a god by his disrespect to the holy horse. They became even more convinced that the horse should be welcomed inside. The second voice was Cassandra, the cursed prophet daughter of Priam. She stood on the walls and called out to anyone who would listen that the horse was a trap, that Greeks lurked inside it, that bringing it into the city would mean the end of Troy. Cassandra had been cursed long ago to always tell the truth and to never be believed. The curse held faithfully, as it had her whole life. The Trojans laughed at her and went on with their preparations. Some of them, in some versions, even tried gently to send her home to rest, the way people sometimes do with a relative who has become a little overwhelmed at a wedding. They tore down part of their own walls to bring the horse inside. The wall they tore down was at the main gate, which had to be widened to accommodate the enormous wooden creature. A detail rich with metaphor, since the Greeks broke the unbreachable wall by getting the Trojans to break it themselves, from the inside, which is the kind of dramatic irony that the ancient bards loved and underlined every chance they got. The horse was rolled into the city on wooden logs, pulled by ropes hauled by men and women together, a great communal effort that took the better part of a day. It was placed in the great central plaza of Troy, in front of the Temple of Athena, with proper offerings made at its hooves. The whole city celebrated. That evening, Troy held the kind of celebration it had not been able to hold in 10 years. The streets filled with music. Wine flowed in quantities that the city had been carefully rationing for a decade and was now happy to release. Children were allowed to stay up far past their normal bedtime. Old soldiers who had been on the walls for the entire duration of the war drank with comrades they had not been able to relax round in years. Women wove garlands of flowers and hung them in the windows. The city's bards composed new songs about the cleverness of the Trojans and the foolishness of the Greeks who had given up. By midnight, much of the city was either asleep where they had collapsed, or too cheerful to notice anything else. And then, very quietly, the trapdoor in the belly of the horse swung open. The warriors inside climbed down one by one in the silence of the central plaza. They moved without speaking. They knew exactly where the gates were. They knew exactly which sentries needed to be silenced. They knew exactly where to signal once the gates were unbarred. Sinon had slipped out of the city earlier in the evening, supposedly to relieve himself outside the walls, and was already at the gates with a small fire lit on the highest tower to signal the waiting Greek fleet. The Greek ships had been moving back toward the beach for hours. They were close enough that the men aboard could see the signal fire when it lit. They came in fast, beaching their ships in the dark, pouring out onto the sand in disciplined ranks. By the time they reached the city walls, the gates were standing open. The men from inside the horse had done their work. The waiting army poured through. What happened that night has been written about in poetry and remembered in painting for nearly 3,000 years, and most of the details we will not dwell on, because the Night of Troy is not the kind of story that wants to be retold in close detail. It is enough to say that the city fell. The walls that had stood for a decade against an army outside were powerless against an army that was already within. By morning, fires were burning across the rooftops. The great temples were broken open. The palaces stood empty of their old occupants. The Trojan warriors who had defended the walls for so many years could not save the city from the enemy, who had been singing along with their celebration only hours before. The Trojan women and children were taken into captivity and divided up among the Greek leaders in the same brutal allocation that had been done at the start of the war with Briseis and Croesus. The war ended exactly as it had begun, with women being claimed as prizes. The Greeks had spent a decade learning nothing. Priam, the old king, did not survive that night. King for so many decades, father of so many children, host to a foreign prince so long ago, whose visit had brought down everything, he ended his long life at the altar of his own household. Hecuba, the queen, was taken into captivity, along with her surviving daughters. Cassandra, the prophet who had warned everyone for years and been believed by no one, was claimed by Agamemnon, in a decision that would soon contribute to his own undoing back home. Andromache, Hector's widow, was claimed by Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles. The royal family that had held Troy for centuries was undone in a single night. Helen, the cause of all this, was found in the women's quarters, waiting. The various poems and plays disagreed on her state of mind in that moment. In some, she had been a willing accomplice the whole time, and was now anxious about facing her old husband. In others, she had grown to long for Sparta, and was relieved that it was finally over. In all of them, Menelaus found her, drew his sword, and prepared to take vengeance for 10 years of war. And in all of them, the moment he saw her face, his sword arm faltered. He could not do it. He led her gently back through the burning city, put her on his ship, and sailed for home. Their reconciliation, in the long version of the story, took years and was not always easy, but they did, eventually, live out the rest of their lives together in Sparta. The shrine that the Spartans built to them centuries later was for a marriage that had survived everything, even itself. As reconciliations go in Greek myth, this one was practically a happy ending. Not everyone in Troy was lost. A few escaped. The most famous of them was a Trojan prince named Aeneas, a son of the goddess Aphrodite by a mortal father, who fought through the night and finally, when it became clear that the city was beyond saving, gathered up his elderly father Anchises onto his shoulders, took his small son Ascanius by the hand, and led a small group of refugees out through a side gate into the countryside. Aeneas's wife was lost in the confusion of that exit, in a detail that the Roman poet Virgil would later treat with great tenderness. He led the survivors south, then east, then west, in a long wandering journey that eventually brought them to the shores of Italy, where they founded the people who would, generations later, build the city of Rome. The Romans would always claim Trojan descent. They would claim that Troy, in a sense, had never really died. It had simply changed addresses and learned a new language. The Greeks burned what was left of Troy when they were done with it. They piled up the city's treasures on their ships: gold, bronze, woven cloth, pottery, the accumulated wealth of one of the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean, and they sailed for home, each fleet returning to its own kingdom. The famous 1,000 ships became a scattered diaspora, each captain making his own way back across the sea. Many never made it. The voyage home was, in some cases, harder than the war had been, because they had won the war by acts of cruelty and impiety that the gods had not forgotten. Storms scattered fleets, ships were lost, whole crews disappeared. Some kings reached home only to find that disasters had befallen their own households in their long absence. Agamemnon, in the bitterest of these stories, returned to Mycenae after 10 years, and met his end at the hand of his own wife Clytemnestra, who had not forgiven him for what had happened to their daughter Iphigenia at Aulis. Diomedes returned home to find his wife had taken up with another man. Menelaus and Helen, alone among the great couples of the war, managed something like a clean ending. For most of the others, the war did not end at Troy. It followed them home, in one shape or another, for the rest of their lives. One particular king, however, would have the strangest homecoming of all. The man whose cleverness had finally ended the war was about to discover that ending a war and getting home from one were two entirely different problems. His journey would take 10 years more and become its own great story. But we will save that for the last part of the night. For now, the smoke was rising over the broken city. The bards on the Greek ships were already composing the first songs about what had happened, and we, with 3,000 years of hindsight on our side, can step back from the story for a moment and ask a different kind of question. Did any of this actually happen? For nearly 3,000 years after the events we have just described, the story of Troy was kept alive by poets. Homer composed his 2 great poems about the war and its aftermath sometime in the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, possibly working from older oral traditions that stretched back centuries before him. The poems were memorized and recited by professional bards across the Greek world, performed at festivals, taught to children, copied and recopied onto papyrus and later parchment. Generations of Greeks knew the war the way we today know our own historical events, in detail, with passionate opinions about the various characters, with a sense that these were people who had once truly walked the earth. But by the time of the Roman Empire, the question of whether Troy had ever actually existed was already being debated by serious scholars. Some travellers visited a place on the coast of what is now Turkey that local people identified as the ancient ruins of Troy, and they reported back what they had seen. Roman emperors made pilgrimages there, throwing wreaths on what they believed was the burial mound of Achilles. But over time, as the world changed and the Roman world gave way to other worlds, the question of where Troy had been, or whether it had ever been anywhere at all, became more uncertain. By the medieval period, Troy had become legend in the truest sense. Most educated people considered the war either a complete fiction or such an exaggerated version of some half-remembered event that it could not really be located in time or space. This was the situation that lasted until the 19th century, when a remarkable and slightly ridiculous figure decided to do something about it. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. He was a German businessman who had made a fortune in various enterprises across several countries before deciding, in middle age, that what he really wanted to do with the rest of his life was prove that Troy had been real. He had loved Homer since boyhood. He had taught himself ancient Greek as an adult, so that he could read the poems in their original language. He believed, against the academic consensus of his time, that Homer had described real places and real events, and that the ruins of Troy were waiting to be found if anyone bothered to look properly. Schliemann was not, by any modern standard, a careful archaeologist. He was a wealthy enthusiast with a great deal of money, a deep belief in his own intuition, and very little training in any of the techniques that the developing field of archaeology was just beginning to work out. He was also notoriously prone to embellishment in his own accounts of what he found, sometimes claiming to have discovered things that other people had pointed out to him first. The credit for actually identifying the most likely site of Troy belongs more properly to a quieter English archaeologist named Frank Calvert, who had been working at a mound called Hisarlik on the Turkish coast for years before Schliemann arrived, and who had concluded that this hill was almost certainly the ancient city. Schliemann visited Calvert, was convinced by his arguments, and then proceeded to do most of the digging himself with such enthusiasm and so little subtlety that he probably destroyed as much as he discovered. As archaeological methods go, his approach was roughly the equivalent of using a backhoe to find a contact lens. Beginning in 1871, Schliemann excavated at Hisarlik. He dug, frankly, like a man looking for buried treasure. He cut a great trench straight down through the centre of the mound, ploughing through layer after layer of ancient occupation, in his hurry to reach what he believed would be the original Homeric city at the bottom. Modern archaeologists looking back at his methods tend to wince audibly. He destroyed in his haste much of what later, more patient digging would have uncovered intact. But he did find something. He found, in fact, more than even he had hoped. The mound at Hisarlik was not the ruin of a single city. It was the ruin of 9 cities, built one on top of another over more than 3,000 years, each one rising from the ruins of the previous one, each one separated from the next by a layer of ash and broken pottery from some violent destruction. Schliemann was looking at a single hill that contained the entire history of a settled place. He labelled the layers from the bottom up, Troy 1, Troy 2, Troy 3, and so on through Troy 9. The earliest of these layers dated back to around 3000 BCE. The latest layers, near the surface, dated to the Roman period. The question that immediately arose was which of these 9 cities had been the Troy of Homer's poems. Schliemann himself believed at first that it was Troy 2, one of the deeper, older layers. He found a remarkable cache of gold objects in that layer and triumphantly announced that he had discovered the treasure of King Priam, including a particular piece of jewellery he photographed his own wife wearing for the world's press. This was, unfortunately, off by about 1,000 years. Troy 2 had been destroyed long before any version of the Trojan War could have happened. The gold belonged to a much earlier era entirely, but the discovery captured the public's imagination and made Schliemann famous, and the public went on calling the find by his romantic name long after the experts had quietly corrected the dating in the academic journals where nobody read them. Later archaeologists working at the site over the following century with much more patience and considerably less dynamite refined the picture considerably. The most likely candidate for the Homeric Troy is now generally considered to be either Troy 6 or Troy 7a, the layers that date to roughly the late 13th century before the Common Era. Troy 6 was a large, prosperous, well-fortified city with thick walls, exactly the kind of place that could have held off an army for 10 years. It came to an end around 1300 BCE, possibly destroyed by an earthquake, possibly by a combination of natural disaster and human attack. The next layer up, Troy 7a, was rebuilt on the ruins, and it too was destroyed, this time clearly by fire and human violence, with weapons and remains found scattered throughout its broken houses. The destruction of Troy 7a is dated to around 1180 BCE. That date is interesting because it sits right in the middle of one of the most dramatic and least understood periods in ancient history. What happened around 1200 BCE has been called by historians the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it is one of those events that gets less attention than it deserves, because it has none of the clean storytelling that history teachers like to work with. It was not a single war or a single conquest. It was, across the entire eastern Mediterranean, a kind of civilizational unravelling, in which one great power after another collapsed within a period of perhaps 50 years. Imagine, in modern terms, the simultaneous fall of several major nations and the loss of writing, trade, and most cities, all within a single generation. Imagine the lights going out across an entire interconnected world. That, roughly, is what happened. The Mycenaean Greeks, the very civilization that produced the historical kernel of the Homeric heroes, vanished. Their great palace centres at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, and elsewhere were burned and abandoned. Their writing system, which scholars now call Linear B, was lost entirely and would not be deciphered until the 1950s. Greek civilization went into what is now called the Dark Age, a period of several centuries in which the population dropped, trade collapsed, building activity ceased, and even the memory of writing was forgotten by the descendants of people who had once been literate. When the Greeks eventually came out of this Dark Age and began to write again, it would be with a completely different alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians. The Hittite Empire to the east, which had dominated what is now central Turkey for centuries, also collapsed in the same period. Their capital city of Hattusa was burned and abandoned. Their successor states shrank to small local kingdoms. The Hittites had been one of the great powers of the ancient world, equal in importance to Egypt and Babylonia. They were gone within a generation, and the language they had spoken would not be deciphered again until the early 20th century. Egypt itself, the most stable of the great Bronze Age civilizations, was struck by waves of seaborne invaders that the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. The Egyptians eventually managed to defend themselves, but the new kingdom that had ruled Egypt for centuries entered a long decline from which it never fully recovered. The records of the pharaoh Ramses III describe great battles fought against the Sea Peoples, and the names of these mysterious invaders include peoples whom some historians have tried to connect to various known cultures around the Mediterranean. The connections remain debated and probably will be for as long as historians have arguments to lose at conferences. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in this same period, dozens of cities were burned and abandoned, never to be rebuilt. Trade routes that had connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, Greece to Anatolia, Cyprus to Crete, were broken and would not be restored for centuries. The whole interconnected web of Bronze Age civilization came apart almost at once. Why? Nobody is entirely sure. The honest answer is that it was probably a combination of several factors all hitting at the same time, a perfect storm of crises that would have been bad individually and were devastating in combination. There is evidence of a long, severe drought across the region in this period, which would have weakened agriculture and stressed populations. There were probably mass migrations of people displaced by that drought, moving from poorer regions to richer ones in search of food and land, putting pressure on the established kingdoms. There were probably earthquakes, since this is an active seismic region. There were probably internal rebellions in places where the strain became too much. There was certainly increased warfare and raiding, as desperate populations turned on each other. The Sea Peoples themselves may have been less a coherent invading force, and more a label that contemporary records used for the various groups of displaced and dangerous migrants pouring across the sea in search of somewhere to settle. Whatever the precise mix of causes, the result was the same. Within a few decades, the world that had existed for several centuries was simply gone. The destruction of Troy 7a sits exactly in this collapse, give or take a few decades. The city's burning is consistent with the kind of violence that was sweeping the entire region. The evidence in the ground itself is unmistakable. Archaeologists working that layer have uncovered arrowheads embedded in walls, hastily buried small treasures that nobody ever came back to dig up, skeletons of people who fell in the streets and were never properly mourned. The destruction was sudden, violent, and complete. The city was not abandoned gracefully. It was attacked, taken, and burned. And it is into the Greek memory of this catastrophe, and of the larger civilizational collapse around it, that the story of the Trojan War was eventually woven, when bards began to compose songs about a great war fought in their grandparents' time against a great city across the sea. There is one more piece of evidence worth mentioning. Among the Hittite records found at Hattusa, before the collapse destroyed that city, archaeologists discovered documents that mention a place called Wilusa, located in northwestern Turkey, exactly where Hizarlik is. The Hittite kings had diplomatic correspondence with the rulers of Wilusa. They mention conflicts in the region. The name Wilusa, scholars now believe, is the same word that became Ilios in Greek, the older name for Troy, which is also the root that gave us the title of the Iliad itself. So we have, in actual contemporary Bronze Age documents, references to the place that the Greeks later remembered as Troy. We have evidence of conflict in that region. We have a destroyed city at exactly the right place at exactly the right time, with exactly the right kind of damage. We do not have a specific battle fought over a specific abducted queen, but we have, beneath the song, the unmistakable echo of something that really happened. This is the strange and humbling thing about myth. When you look at it properly, it is not, as we sometimes think today, just fanciful storytelling, the ancient equivalent of make-believe. Myth is, in many cases, the carrier of compressed historical memory across centuries and millennia, encoded in story form because story is what survives when records do not. The Greeks who first composed the Trojan War cycle were the descendants of survivors of a civilizational collapse, looking back across several centuries of dark age at a half-remembered great age of their ancestors. They did not have written records of what their grandparents' had known. They had stories. And in those stories, the memory of a great war fought across the sea against a wealthy city behind impossible walls, in the last days of the old world, had been preserved in a form supple enough to be sung and remembered and passed on. Other civilizations did the same thing. The flood stories that appear in so many cultures around the world, the Greek flood with Deucalion that we met earlier, the Mesopotamian flood of Gilgamesh, the biblical flood of Noah, the various flood stories in the Americas and Asia, probably preserve memories of real catastrophic flooding in various parts of the world at various times in the past, transformed into narratives that could survive long after the actual events had been forgotten. The Greek legend of Atlantis, the great civilization that supposedly sank beneath the waves, may preserve a real memory of the eruption of Thera, the volcano now called Santorini, which destroyed Minoan civilization on the nearby island of Crete around 1600 BCE. Real disasters become stories. Real wars become epics. Real heroes sometimes become demigods over enough centuries of retelling. This does not mean every detail of every myth is historically accurate. The wooden horse may or may not have been a wooden horse. Some scholars have proposed that the horse in the story is a folk memory of a battering ram, or of a particular type of ship that was called a horse, or simply a symbolic image of some other clever ruse used to get inside the walls. The duels between specific named heroes are almost certainly literary embellishments rather than transcribed events. The gods, of course, did not literally watch the battles from Olympus. But beneath the embellishments, there is a real city, in a real place, that really fell to a real attack, in a period when many real cities were falling. The poets did not invent the war. They received it from their ancestors, and they shaped it into the form we have today over many centuries of retelling around many evening fires. When we listen to the Iliad and the Odyssey now, we are doing something that humans have been doing in some version for nearly 3,000 years. Sitting in the dark, listening to the story of a war that ended a world. The world that ended was the Bronze Age, the great interconnected civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean in the second millennium before the Common Era. The story that carried its memory forward has lasted longer than the empire that built the city, longer than the city itself, longer than the dust of the soldiers on both sides, longer than even the language they spoke. It has lasted because story is durable in a way that stone is not. The walls of Troy were broken in a single night. The poem about them is still standing. 3,000 years later, with no sign of crumbling. The wooden horse, whatever it was originally, has outlived every empire that ever feared it. And one of the survivors of that war, the cleverest of all of them, was just then beginning the long voyage home that would itself become one of the most enduring stories in human imagination. He had no idea, when he sailed away from the smoking ruins of Troy with his small fleet of 12 ships, that it would take him another 10 long years to reach his own front door. He had no idea that the gods who had helped him win the war were already lining up their grievances about how he had won it. He had no idea what was waiting for him out on that wine-dark sea. He thought, on the morning he set sail, that he would be home in a few weeks. He thought he might be sitting under his fig tree again by the end of the month. He thought wrong, in the way that only a man who has just survived the worst war of his age can think wrong about what comes next. But that is for the last stretch of the night. The little fleet of 12 ships sailed away from the smoking beach, with a fair wind at their backs and a cargo of plunder in their holds. Odysseus stood at the prow of his own vessel, looking back at the country he had spent 10 years staring at across a strip of sand. The walls of the broken city receded slowly in the distance. He had every reason to feel, for the first time in a decade, lighter than he had been. That feeling lasted approximately as long as it took the wind to change. The Greek captains had won the war, and had immediately begun to behave, as a group, like men who had recently won a lottery and were now going to make every possible bad decision with the prize money. They had taken too much treasure and too few prayers from Troy. They had broken into temples and looted things that probably should have been left alone. Several of them, in the heat of the night Troy fell, had committed acts that the gods had personally taken offense to, even by the loose standards of conduct that the gods applied to wartime behavior. There would be consequences. There were already consequences on Olympus, where various deities were quietly preparing various weather patterns for the journey home. Odysseus had been more careful than most, but he had not been entirely innocent either, and even if he had been, the small island of Ithaca lay on the far side of an enormous sea that he was now going to have to cross, while several gods worked out who they wanted to inconvenience. The Greek crews, meanwhile, were in the kind of celebratory mood that historically tends to invite trouble. They had survived. They were going home. What could possibly go wrong? His first stop was a place called Ismarus, on the coast of Thrace, where a people called the Cicones had a fortified town, The fleet attacked, took the town, killed its defenders, and gathered up its wealth in the standard rough fashion of these things. Odysseus, well aware that the Cicones had inland neighbours who would come to their aid sooner or later, gave the order to return to the ships immediately and depart. His men, drunk on victory and on the local wine they had just looted, refused. They preferred to feast on the beach, Odysseus argued. They ignored him. By the next morning the inland Cicones had arrived in force, well rested and well armed, and the Greek raiding party had to fight their way back to the ships in some haste. Several of Odysseus's men were lost on the shore. The fleet sailed away with fewer crew than it had landed with, and with the first useful lesson of the voyage already delivered. The lesson was that when Odysseus told them to leave, they should leave. They would forget this lesson at regular intervals across the next 10 years. The wind that drove them away from the Cicones did not stop driving them. It became a storm. The storm carried them south, off course, and well away from the route they had planned. For 9 days they ran before the weather, with no clear idea of where they were going. When the storm finally lifted, they made landfall on a coast that none of them recognized. It was warm. The air smelled of strange flowers. The shore was lined with people who looked, at first glance, perfectly friendly. These were the people the Greeks would later call the lotus eaters. They lived on a particular kind of fruit, sweet and golden and faintly luminous, that grew on the trees of their country. The fruit did something to whoever ate it. Odysseus sent 3 of his men ashore to ask the locals where they were and to scout for provisions. The locals greeted the scouts kindly, and as a gesture of welcome gave them some of their fruit. The 3 Greeks ate. What happened next was strange and quiet. The men who had eaten the fruit no longer wanted to leave. They did not want to go back to the ship. They did not want to go home. They did not, in fact, want anything at all except to stay where they were and eat more fruit. When Odysseus came ashore to find his missing scouts, he discovered them sitting on the warm sand, smiling pleasantly, with no clear memory of who he was or why anyone should be in any hurry about anything. The fruit, whatever it was, simply erased ambition. It dissolved homesickness, love of family, sense of duty, sense of time, the entire structure of motivations that a person normally walks around with. The men were perfectly content. They were also, in any practical sense, lost to their lives. Modern readers tend to find this episode unsettling precisely because it is so recognizable. We may not have a magical fruit, but we have a long list of substances and pastimes that produce a milder version of the same effect, and we recognize the temptation even when we have never been to that particular coast. Odysseus did the only thing he could do. He had his sailors carry the 3 men back to the ships by force, tied them to the rowing benches, and ordered the fleet to set sail at once before any more of the crew could go ashore and start chewing on the local landscape. The Greeks rowed away from that coast with 3 of their number weeping for the fruit they could no longer reach. Odysseus had been kind in his fashion. He had not left them to fade away on a beach, but he had also begun to understand something important about the journey he was on. The dangers in front of him were not mostly going to be the kind of dangers that swords could solve. The fleet sailed on. The next island they came to was rocky, fertile, and apparently uninhabited by anyone with the social skills to plant a vineyard. Goats grazed wild on the slopes. Wild grain grew in the meadows. There was no sign of civilization. The Greeks, in need of fresh supplies, anchored in a sheltered cove and went ashore to explore. Odysseus took 12 of his best men inland to investigate a great cave they had spotted on the hillside. The cave belonged, as it turned out, to someone. It was furnished, in a rough way, with stone pens for sheep and goats, hung racks of drying cheese, and large wooden buckets of curdling milk. Whoever lived here was a herdsman. A herdsman, however, on a particularly large scale. The cheese wheels were the size of cartwheels. The buckets were the size of barrels. The footprints in the dust were larger than any human footprint had any business being. Odysseus's men, taking in the size of the place, suggested they grab a few cheeses and a couple of lambs and leave very quickly. Odysseus, in one of his less wise decisions, decided he wanted to meet the owner of the cave and, in keeping with the customs of the time, claim the gift that any host was supposed to offer a stranger who arrived at his door. This was a calculation based on Greek customs of hospitality. It did not survive contact with the cave's actual occupant. When the master of the cave came home that evening, he came with a great flock of sheep, which he drove inside before sealing the entrance with an enormous boulder. The boulder, the Greeks immediately noticed, was so large that no human strength could possibly move it. They were now sealed inside a cave with whoever had just arrived. And whoever had arrived was a Cyclops, a single-eyed giant called Polyphemus, son of Poseidon himself, who took one look at the small Greek visitors crouched in the firelight and asked them, in a voice that came down from a great height, what exactly they thought they were doing in his home. Polyphemus was not a kind host. He was not interested in the customs of hospitality that Odysseus had hoped to invoke. He was, in fact, interested in his guests in a way that the guests very quickly came to regret. Several of Odysseus's men did not survive that first night in the cave. The Cyclops, having satisfied his appetite, rolled himself up by the fire and went to sleep, with the great boulder still blocking the only way out. Odysseus sat in the dark of the cave and did some thinking. He could not deal with the Cyclops by force, because then no one would be left who could move the boulder, and the remaining Greeks would die in there of slow starvation. He could not escape because the boulder could not be moved. He had to find another way. By morning he had a plan. When Polyphemus woke and rolled the boulder aside to let his sheep out to graze, the Greeks did not try to escape with them. The Cyclops would have caught them. Polyphemus closed the cave behind him and went out for the day. The Greeks were alone in the cave with the sheep, the cheeses, and an enormous wooden club the Cyclops had brought home the night before. Odysseus had his men sharpen the end of the club to a fine point and harden it in the fire. When evening came and Polyphemus returned, herding his sheep back inside and sealing the boulder behind them, Odysseus offered him a generous gift. He had brought with him a small skin of an exceptionally strong wine, a famous vintage he had received from a priest of Apollo back during the raid on the Cicones. The wine was so potent that it was normally diluted with 20 parts of water to 1 of wine. Odysseus offered it to Polyphemus undiluted, as a gesture of friendship. The Cyclops drank it gratefully. He had never tasted wine like this. He drank more. He drank, in fact, the entire skin. He grew warm and friendly. He asked Odysseus, between cheerful belches, for his name, promising to give his small guest a special gift in return. Odysseus, who had been waiting for this question, smiled politely and gave his name as Autis. In Greek, Autis means nobody. He explained that this was the name his parents had given him, that everyone called him Nobody, and that he was honoured to be in such excellent company. Polyphemus, who was now thoroughly drunk and not in any condition to evaluate the names of his guests critically, promised solemnly that nobody would be the last of his visitors to be eaten, which Polyphemus considered a generous compliment. Then he fell over and went to sleep beside the fire. The Greeks worked quickly and quietly. They took the hardened wooden stake from the fire and, working together, dealt with the Cyclops' single great eye while he slept. The pain woke Polyphemus, who roared so loudly that the other Cyclops of the island came running to the entrance of his cave, calling through the boulder to ask what was wrong. "Who is hurting you?" they called. Polyphemus, in his agony, shouted the only answer that made sense to him. "Nobody is hurting me. Nobody is the one who has done this." The other Cyclopes, hearing this, concluded that their neighbour was clearly suffering from some divine torment and was beyond mortal help, and went back to bed. They did not even pause to think about what they had just heard. The trick of the name had worked exactly as Odysseus had intended. Inside the dark cave, listening to the giant's cousins shuffling away, Odysseus must have allowed himself the smallest possible smile. The next morning, when Polyphemus rolled the boulder aside to let his sheep out, the Greeks tied themselves underneath the bellies of the largest sheep, 3 to each ram, hidden by the long fleece. Polyphemus felt the back of each sheep as it passed, suspicious that the Greeks might be trying to ride out on top of them. He did not think to check beneath. The Greeks rode out clinging to the underside of his own flock, a detail that has been delighting children ever since the story was first told. They reached the ships and pushed off in a hurry. As they rowed away, Odysseus, who could never quite resist a final flourish, stood at the stern and called back to the blinded giant on the shore. He shouted his real name. He told the Cyclops that he, Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, was the one who had outwitted him. Polyphemus, hearing this, prayed to his father Poseidon for vengeance. Poseidon heard. From that moment forward, Odysseus had the god of the sea as his personal enemy. Every storm that struck him in the next 10 years would have a particular intelligence behind it. Every misfortune at sea would be exactly the misfortune Poseidon could arrange. Odysseus had given his enemy his real name, and his name was now a target. It is one of the few moments in the Odyssey where the hero's cleverness clearly fails him, not in the deed, but in the bragging that followed it. The Greeks had a particular fondness for showing their cleverest heroes outwitted just once by their own egos. The fleet sailed on, smaller now but still intact. Their next stop was a strange floating island called Aeolia, the home of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. Aeolus was not exactly a god, but not exactly a man either, one of those intermediate beings the cosmos seemed full of. He lived on his floating island with his 6 sons and 6 daughters, who, in the more disturbing detail of the story, were married to each other in a tidy round of family arrangements that nobody is quite sure how to interpret. The family hosted Odysseus's crew for a full month. They feasted them, told them stories, asked careful questions about the war that had ended. When the Greeks finally prepared to leave, Aeolus gave Odysseus a particular parting gift. It was a great leather bag tied with a silver cord. Inside the bag were all of the unfavourable winds of the world, every storm wind and contrary breeze, sealed away so that they could not interfere with the voyage home. The only wind Aeolus had left free was the west wind, which would push the ships gently and steadily eastward to Ithaca. If Odysseus kept the bag tied, the journey home would be peaceful and short. The fleet sailed. For 9 days they ran east before the west wind, exactly as promised. On the dawn of the 10th day, the shape of Ithaca rose on the horizon. The rocky island, the familiar coastline, the harbour Odysseus had not seen in 20 years. Odysseus, who had been steering the ship personally and refusing to sleep for 9 days straight to make sure nothing went wrong, finally let himself rest. He lay down on the deck and was asleep within seconds. His men, who had been watching Odysseus guard the strange leather bag for the entire voyage, had spent 9 days quietly convincing themselves that the bag contained gold. They reasoned, in the way that crewmen everywhere reason, that the king had received a parting gift of treasure from a generous host and had been hoarding it all the way home without sharing. As Odysseus slept and Ithaca shimmered on the horizon, the men reached the inescapable conclusion that this was their moment. They untied the silver cord, they opened the bag. Every contrary wind in the world rushed out at once. The fleet was struck instantly by a storm of impossible violence, and within minutes the ships were being driven away from Ithaca at terrifying speed. 9 days they had spent crossing the calm sea. The contrary winds blew them all the way back to Aeolus's island in a single afternoon. 20 years of waiting, undone in a single afternoon, because someone wanted to check whether a bag contained gold. Aeolus, when Odysseus arrived back at his door asking for help, took one look at the situation and politely declined. Clearly, he said, Odysseus was hated by the gods. Aeolus could not afford to be associated with such a man. The door was closed. The fleet sailed away again, this time without divine wind to help them, knowing that they had been within sight of home and had lost it because someone could not let a sealed bag alone. Sailors have been making versions of this mistake for the entire history of sailing. It is one of the more relatable parts of the Odyssey, if not the most flattering. Their next landfall was a tall cliffed harbour that looked, from the sea, like a safe and welcoming port. Odysseus, by now wary of any place that looked too friendly, anchored his own ship outside the harbour entrance, in open water. The rest of the fleet, 11 ships in all, sailed inside, where they could moor more comfortably alongside the inner cliffs. This was the worst possible decision they could have made, though they could not have known it. The harbour belonged to the Laestrygonians, a people of enormous size and brutal temperament who lived on the cliffs above. When the Greek ships were nicely arranged below them, the Laestrygonians simply began rolling boulders down. The 11 ships in the harbour were lost almost at once, smashed where they sat by enormous stones falling from above. Only Odysseus's own ship, anchored outside the harbour, was able to cut its cable and flee. The fleet that had left Troy with 12 ships was now down to 1. The captain stood on the deck of that single ship and watched the smoke rise from the harbour behind them, and the journey home, which had already seemed too long, began to take on a different shape entirely. It was no longer a journey home, it was now a journey toward home, with a constant fear that there might not be enough of him left by the time he arrived. The single surviving ship sailed on. It came to another island called Aeaea, where a witch named Circe lived in a palace in the middle of the forest. Odysseus, having learned at last to be cautious, sent half his remaining men under his second-in-command, Eurylochus, to scout the interior while he stayed with the other half by the ship. Eurylochus and his scouting party found Circe's palace. They found her seated at her great loom, weaving a soft fabric that glowed faintly in the firelight. She welcomed them. She was unsettlingly beautiful and unsettlingly kind. She brought out food and drink and invited the men to refresh themselves. Most of the men, hungry and exhausted, accepted gratefully. Eurylochus, who had developed a healthy suspicion of generous hosts after the past few weeks, stayed outside the door and watched through a window. What he saw stopped his breath. As soon as the Greeks finished her food and drink, Circe rose from her loom, touched each man on the shoulder with a small carved wand, and they were no longer men. They were pigs, real pigs, with bristly hides and round bellies, looking up at her in confusion with their old human eyes. She herded them out a back door into a stone pen and went calmly back to her weaving, as if nothing more remarkable had happened than feeding the cat. Eurylochus, in shock, ran all the way back to the ship. He told Odysseus what he had seen. The remaining men panicked. Odysseus took up his sword and his bow and announced that he would go himself to free the others. The crew begged him not to. He went anyway. They were his men. The pattern of his life had always been this. The others made the mistake, and Odysseus walked into the danger to fix it. On the way to the palace, he was met on the forest path by a young man who turned out to be the god Hermes in disguise. Hermes, who liked Odysseus, gave him a piece of advice and a small white flower called moly, which would protect him from Circe's enchantments. Odysseus took the flower. He continued to the palace. Circe welcomed him. She brought out the same food and drink. He ate. He drank. She touched his shoulder with her wand. Nothing happened. Circe stepped back, astonished. She drew the wand back to strike again. Odysseus drew his sword and laid the point against her throat. He demanded the release of his men. Circe, who had long known by prophecy that one mortal would be immune to her magic, and that this mortal would be Odysseus, recognized him in that moment and began, of all things, to laugh. She released the men. She restored them to their human shapes, though apparently several of them came back a little embarrassed about the experience and never spoke of it again. She invited the entire crew up to her palace and hosted them properly, this time without enchantments. They stayed on her island for a full year, eating well, resting from their journey, slowly recovering from the various troubles they had accumulated. Circe and Odysseus became, in the slow way of such things, lovers, the witch and the king, in a forest palace at the edge of the world, while his wife waited at home. When his men eventually grew restless and reminded him that they had houses and families to return to, Odysseus prepared to leave. Circe accepted this with the dignity of someone who had always known he was a guest, but she warned him that he could not sail directly home. Before he reached Ithaca, she said, he had to make one more journey first. He had to sail to the very edge of the world, to the entrance of the underworld itself, and speak with the ghost of a particular prophet named Tiresias, who had information he would need to survive what came next. This was, by any measure, the most disturbing instruction Odysseus had yet received. No living mortal was supposed to enter the realm of the dead. Heracles had done it once, but he had been half divine and on a mission ordered by the gods. Odysseus was simply a tired king who wanted to go home. The fact that the only way forward led through the underworld was, in his own dry summary of the situation, less than encouraging. But he went. He sailed his single ship to the edge of the world, to a grey shore where the sun never quite shone properly and the trees grew without leaves. There, following Circe's careful instructions, he dug a deep trench, made offerings of milk and honey and wine and barley, and called up the ghosts of the dead. They came in great crowds. The dead were drawn to the offerings the way a thirsty person is drawn to water. Odysseus had to keep them back with his drawn sword, allowing them to drink only one at a time, in the order Tiresias had prescribed. The first ghost to come up was unexpected and slightly embarrassing. It was Elpenor, one of his own crewmen, a young man who had fallen asleep on the roof of Circe's palace after drinking too much, had rolled off in the night, and had perished without anyone noticing in the morning rush of departure. Elpenor begged Odysseus to return to Circe's island and give his body a proper burial. Odysseus, who had not even realized the young man was dead, promised solemnly that he would. It was one of those moments where the great epic suddenly notices a very small human detail and refuses to look away. Tiresias came next. The old prophet drank from the offerings and then turned his blind eyes toward Odysseus and gave him a long, careful prediction. The journey home would be hard, Tiresias said, but not impossible. The most important warning concerned the cattle of the sun god Helios. Odysseus would come to an island where these sacred cattle grazed. He must not touch them. He must keep his crew from touching them. If they did, he would lose all of his men and would arrive home alone, on a strange ship that did not belong to him, to find his own house overrun by trouble. He would have to deal with the trouble before he could rest. And even after that, his journey was not entirely over. He would have to take an oar inland from the sea, walking until he reached a country where the people did not know what an oar was, where someone would mistake the oar for a winnowing fan used to sift grain. There he was to plant the oar in the earth and make an offering to the sea god Poseidon, in apology for everything that had passed. Then, and only then, would his wandering truly end. He would live to old age, surrounded by his family, and die peacefully far from the sea. It was both a warning and a comfort, in the careful balance the great prophets always managed. Odysseus thanked the old man and let him go back to the dark. Other ghosts came up after Tiresias had been given his drink. Odysseus saw his own mother, Anticlea, whom he had not known was dead. She told him she had died of grief during his long absence, simply from missing him too much. He tried to embrace her 3 times. Each time his arms passed through her like through smoke. The dead were a kind of presence without substance. He wept and let her go. He saw Achilles, walking among the shades, still tall and bright but quieter than he had been in life. They spoke. Odysseus tried to comfort the dead hero by reminding him of his great glory. Achilles, who had once chosen this glory in full knowledge of what it would cost him, looked at him steadily and said something that the Greeks remembered for centuries afterward. He would rather, Achilles said, be the lowest farmhand on the poorest farm in the upper world than be king of all the dead in this one. Glory had not, in the end, been worth what he had paid for it. The wisdom came too late for him, but he passed it along. Odysseus also saw Agamemnon, who warned him to be careful when he reached home, because not every homecoming was a happy one, and a man should be cautious about trusting his own house too quickly. He saw a shadow of Heracles in some versions, the great hero having been taken up to Olympus while only his image remained below. He saw the legendary judges of the dead, and various famous sinners suffering quietly for their various crimes. He saw Sisyphus pushing his boulder up its endless hill. He saw Tantalus standing in his water that always receded when he reached for it. The whole architecture of the afterlife was laid out before him, and at some point he understood that he was being shown more than was strictly necessary for his quest. He was being shown, perhaps, what death itself was, so that the rest of his journey, however hard, would feel like something he could still choose to do. Eventually the crowds of ghosts grew thicker, and Odysseus, finally afraid, turned away. He climbed back into his ship. He sailed back toward the world of the living. On the way home he stopped briefly at Circe's island to bury Elpenor properly, as he had promised. The witch gave him further warnings about what lay ahead. She had known where his journey would take him next, and now she filled in the details Tiresias had left out. His ship would pass first near an island of sirens, strange winged women who sang from rocky shores. Their song was the most beautiful sound in the world. Any sailor who heard it would steer his ship toward them and crash on the rocks at their feet, where his bones would join the great white pile that had been accumulating there for centuries. Most ships simply did not survive the song. Odysseus, who could not bear the idea of passing the most beautiful sound in the world without hearing it, made an arrangement with his crew. He had them stop up their own ears with beeswax so that they could not hear at all. Then he had them tie him securely to the mast, with strict instructions that no matter what he did or said or screamed as they passed the island, they were not to release him. The arrangement worked. The crew rowed past the island in complete silence, hearing nothing. Odysseus, the only man on the ship who could hear, listened to the song and went briefly out of his mind with longing. He shouted to his men to free him. He thrashed against his bonds. He begged. They could not hear a word he was saying. They simply rowed on, watching their captain rave at the mast and assuming correctly that this was exactly the situation he had warned them about. The song faded behind them. Odysseus came back to himself slowly, hollow-eyed, the only man who had ever heard the sirens and lived to talk about it. The crew untied him. Nobody asked him what the song had sounded like. Odysseus, in any case, was not sure he had words for it. Then came the narrow strait between 2 cliffs. On one side lay Charybdis, an enormous whirlpool that 3 times a day sucked in the sea and 3 times spat it out, swallowing any ship that came too close. On the other side, in a cave on the opposite cliff, lived Scylla, a six-headed monster who would lean out as ships passed and take 6 men from the deck, 1 per head, before disappearing back into her cave. Circe had told him that there was no way to avoid the cost of this passage. He could try Charybdis and lose everything, or he could pass close to Scylla and lose only 6 men. There was no third option. The Greeks had a particular knack for designing scenarios where every available choice was a bad one, and the strait was perhaps their masterpiece in the genre. Odysseus chose Scylla. He could not bring himself to tell his crew what was coming. He was afraid that if they knew, they would refuse to row or would scatter in panic. So he simply ordered them to row hard along the cliff. They obeyed. Scylla, when they passed, did exactly what Circe had said she would do. 6 of Odysseus's men were lost to her as the ship passed beneath. The others rowed past in shock, their hands still on the oars, their captain staring straight ahead. He had lost 6 more men to spare the rest. It was, by his own bitter accounting later, the worst single decision he had ever had to make. The fact that it had been the right decision did not make it any easier to live with. The ship sailed on, smaller by 6 more crew, into waters Odysseus had been hoping never to see. Ahead of him lay the island Tiresias had warned him about, the island where the cattle of Helios grazed, the sun god's own sacred herd, which no mortal was supposed to touch. He tried to talk his men into sailing past. He told them about the warning. He told them they could not stop there. They were exhausted. They were hungry. They begged him to let them rest just for 1 night on the shore. They swore they would not touch a single cow. Odysseus, against his better judgment, agreed. A storm blew up the next morning, the kind of storm that does not pass quickly. For a full month the wind held them on that island. Their provisions ran out. They tried to live on fish, but the fish would not come. They tried roots and shellfish. Hunger grew. Odysseus went up into the hills one day to pray for help. While he was gone, his second-in-command Eurylochus, who had survived Circe's island and had been with Odysseus longer than any other man, finally cracked. He persuaded the crew that it was better to slaughter one of the sacred cows and live than to starve to death and be remembered as the most pious fools on the sea. They could make offerings of the bones, he said. They could ask forgiveness afterwards. The gods would understand. The gods did not understand. When Odysseus came down from the hills and smelled meat cooking, he knew exactly what had happened. He raged at his men. He wept. But the act was done. The meat was already in their stomachs. Strange things began to happen. The hides of the slaughtered cattle began to crawl on the ground. The spits over the fire began to low like the cows themselves. The very meat in the cooking pots called out in distress. The omens were impossible to misread. The men, suddenly sober and afraid, finished their feast in silence and slept badly. The next morning the wind dropped. They put to sea. They had not gone far when Zeus himself, at the request of an outraged Helios, struck their ship with a single thunderbolt. The mast cracked. The hull came apart. The crew, every one of them, was lost to the sea. Only Odysseus survived. He clung to a piece of broken mast, lashed to a piece of the keel, and drifted alone on the open water. He drifted for 9 days. His ship was gone. His men were gone. The fleet that had left Troy with 12 ships and over 600 men had been reduced to 1 drifting man on a piece of wreckage. The arithmetic of his journey home was now complete and undeniable. Every one of them had been a man with a family. Every one of them had been promised a homecoming. None of them had received one. On the 10th day he washed up on an unknown shore. The shore belonged to an island called Ogygia, the home of a sea nymph named Calypso, who lived alone in a great cave surrounded by vines and clear streams. She found him on her beach, half dead from the sea and from grief. She took him in. She fed him. She nursed him back to strength, and when he was well again, she did not let him go. Calypso fell in love with him. She offered him immortality if he would stay with her. She offered him a life without aging, without illness, without death, on her green and gentle island, with her forever. It was an extraordinary offer. Most mortals would not have hesitated. Odysseus, who had been gone from his wife for nearly 20 years by this point, who had lost everything and everyone he had set out with, who could no longer quite remember exactly what his son's face looked like, since the boy had been a baby when he last saw him, refused. He thanked her for her kindness. He admitted that she was more beautiful than his mortal wife had ever been. He admitted that immortality was probably the better deal on paper, and he said, gently but firmly, that he still wanted to go home. He still wanted to sit under his fig tree and look at the small rocky island of Ithaca with his old eyes. He still wanted Penelope. Calypso did not let him go. She kept him on her island. Not by force exactly. She did not chain him. She simply did not let him leave, in the way that an entire island can refuse to let a single man leave when there is no boat, no crew, and no way off. For 7 years she kept him there. Every day he walked down to the shore and looked east, in the direction of home, and wept. Every evening he came back to her cave and lay beside her, his mind a long way away, on a small rocky island in a sea he could not reach. This is where we will leave him for now, alone on Calypso's shore, with no ship, no men, and no way home. The greatest fleet ever assembled by Greece had been reduced, by the long, slow attrition of a journey that should have taken weeks, and had instead taken years, to a single weeping king at the sea's edge. The cleverest man in the world had been outwitted by something cleverer than himself, which was, in this case, not a person or a monster or a god, but simply distance. He had no idea how he was ever going to cross it. But there was someone he had not forgotten, and more importantly, there was someone who had not forgotten him. Far across the sea, on a small rocky island called Ithaca, a woman was finally about to run out of patience. That is, for the last stretch of the night. The small rocky island of Ithaca had not been doing well in the king's absence. For nearly 20 years now, Penelope had been alone at the palace, raising their son and managing the kingdom and waiting for news of a husband who had never come home and might be dead, or might be wandering, or might be quite happily settled somewhere else and not in any hurry to return. Nobody knew. Word from Troy had reached the island years earlier. The war was over, the city had fallen, Odysseus had survived. After that, silence. The other Greek kings had come home mostly. Their wives knew what had happened to them. Penelope did not have this comfort. She had only the absence. She had not, however, been the kind of woman to fall apart. She had run the household. She had supervised the estates. She had brought up Telemachus to be as fine a young man as the situation allowed, with the help of her father-in-law Laertes, who lived in retirement in a small farmstead in the country, and a household of servants who still remembered their old king fondly. Through the first 10 years, while the war was still being fought, life on Ithaca had been quiet and dignified. The kingdom had waited. Penelope had waited. There had been a certain comfort in waiting, when at least everyone knew what they were waiting for. But once the war ended, and the years began to pile up after that with still no sign of Odysseus, a particular problem began to develop. Penelope was, as far as anyone in the surrounding islands could tell, almost certainly a widow. The kingdom of Ithaca was, as far as anyone could tell, vacant of a king. There was a young heir, Telemachus, but he had been a teenager when the trouble started, and no one was particularly prepared to wait for him to grow up. A queen without a husband and a kingdom without a king were, in the local political logic of the time, a vacancy waiting to be filled. The suitors began to arrive. They came from every island in the Western Greek world. Young men, most of them from noble families. Some of them were perfectly decent in their personal lives, when they were not currently being suitors. Others were simply opportunists who had heard there was a wealthy queen on Ithaca and wanted to test whether they could become a king by marriage. There were eventually over 100 of them, by the count the poet settled on, though the number varied between different sources. They came to the palace. They proposed to Penelope. She declined. They proposed again. She declined again. They settled in. This was the part the local politics had not quite anticipated. The suitors, having been refused once, did not go home. They believed, or at least claimed to believe, that Penelope would eventually choose one of them, and they intended to be present in the palace when she did. So they simply moved into the great hall, set up camp, and began eating their way through the royal stores. Every day they slaughtered cattle from the royal herds. Every day they drank wine from the royal cellars. Every day they expected to be served by the royal servants. They had in effect transformed the Queen's home into the world's longest-running uninvited dinner party. By the 3rd year of this arrangement, the palace cooks had quietly started watering down the wine, in a small act of household resistance that nobody quite acknowledged out loud. Penelope tried to stall them. She told them she could not remarry until she had finished weaving a particular burial shroud for her father-in-law Laertes, a project of the kind that an elderly relative might reasonably need. She wove the shroud during the day in plain sight of the suitors. Then, at night, by lamplight, she unravelled what she had woven during the day. The shroud, for nearly 3 years, made no progress whatsoever. The suitors were patient at first, then puzzled, then suspicious, and finally a serving woman who had been bribed by one of them noticed the unravelling and reported it. The trick was discovered. Penelope had to finish the weaving for real. The pressure to choose a husband intensified. Telemachus, by this point, was nearly 20 years old. He had grown up almost entirely without a father, but he had been raised on stories about Odysseus, and he had absorbed both the longing and the determination that those stories produced. He had also, more recently, been receiving visits from a wise old family friend who showed up at his shoulder at moments when he needed advice. The wise old family friend was, of course, Athena in disguise, the same goddess who had quietly been managing Odysseus's affairs for 2 decades. She had decided that the long absence of her favourite mortal had gone on quite long enough, and she had begun to put the final pieces of his return together. Up on Olympus, Athena petitioned her father Zeus. She pointed out that Odysseus had been suffering for far longer than the gods had originally intended. She pointed out that Poseidon, whose grievance had set most of the trouble in motion, was currently away visiting the distant Ethiopians, and would not notice if certain wheels were quietly turned in the meantime. She asked for permission to bring Odysseus home. Zeus, who had been waiting for this conversation for some time, agreed. He sent his messenger Hermes down to the island of Ogygia with a clear order. Calypso, the sea nymph who had been keeping Odysseus on her island for 7 years, was to release him at once. She was to provide him with timber and tools to build a raft. She was to give him food and wine for the voyage. She was to send him on his way. Hermes arrived at Calypso's cave one morning with his wing sandals dusted from the long flight. He delivered his message. Calypso was, in the stories, furious. She protested that the gods were unfair. She pointed out that Zeus himself was famously fond of mortal women and surely could understand the situation. She complained, in the particular voice that immortals sometimes use when they have been overruled, that she had not asked for this man to wash up on her shore, but that she had grown attached to him, and that she had offered him immortality, which was, frankly, the best possible gift any sea nymph could offer, and that he had refused it for reasons she could not understand, and that now Hermes was asking her to send him away on top of all of that. Hermes listened politely. The order, he said, was the order. Calypso accepted it eventually because there was nothing else she could do. She did, in her way, accept it gracefully in the end. She went to Odysseus, who was sitting on the shore as he sat every day, and told him that he was free to leave. She showed him a stand of tall trees from which he could cut timber. She gave him an axe, an adze, a drill, and lengths of rope. She told him how to bind the planks together into a strong raft. She helped him stitch a sail, and on the morning the raft was finished she sent him off with fresh provisions and a favourable wind, kissed his forehead, and watched the sail disappear into the east. Calypso has often been treated harshly in the retellings, but in the actual telling, she let him go gently. She was, in the end, a goddess who had loved a mortal too well to keep him longer than the order demanded. Odysseus sailed for 17 days across calm seas, steering by the stars Calypso had taught him to read. On the 18th day he sighted land. He was almost ashore when his luck ran out. Poseidon, returning from his visit to the Ethiopians, looked down and saw exactly the sight he had not been expecting to see. The mortal he had been punishing for 20 years was almost home. The sea god did not have time to undo what had been arranged in his absence, but he did have time for one last storm. He raised one. It was a particularly creative one. Odysseus's raft was broken apart almost immediately. The clever king found himself, once again, clinging to a piece of broken wood in heavy seas, with land tantalizingly close and currents trying to drag him back out. He was saved by a small sea goddess named Ino, who happened to be passing and took pity on him. She gave him a magical scarf that would keep him from drowning if he wore it around his chest, and instructed him to swim to shore. He swam. The scarf worked. He washed up on a strange beach, half dead from exhaustion and exposure, and crawled into a thicket of bushes to sleep. The beach belonged to the kingdom of the Phaeacians, a peaceful, prosperous people who lived on a beautiful island in the Western Sea and were famously skilled sailors. The next morning the king's daughter, a young woman named Nausicaa, came down to the river that ran near the beach to do her washing, with a group of her serving women. They had brought a bull with them to play with, the way young women had brought bulls to riverside picnics in every century since people had thought of weaving bulls. Their bull happened to roll into the bushes where Odysseus was sleeping. They went to fetch it. Odysseus woke to find himself surrounded by a group of laughing young women who had just dropped a ball nearly onto his head. He was, as he was acutely aware, naked, sunburned, and crusted in sea salt. The serving women fled in panic. Nausicaa, who was made of sterner stuff, stood her ground. Odysseus, with the diplomatic skill that had once helped him outwit a giant, managed to introduce himself in a way that made the strange encounter seem reasonable instead of alarming. He was a shipwrecked stranger. He needed clothes, food, and a guide to the local king. The princess was, he made clear with great delicacy, the most beautiful person he had seen in years, and he was deeply grateful to have washed up at her feet rather than anyone else's. Nausicaa, charmed, gave him clothes from her laundry, fed him, and brought him to her father's palace. The Phaeacian king, Alcinous, received Odysseus as a guest. He held a banquet. A blind bard sang songs at the meal, and one of the songs happened to be about the war at Troy and the wooden horse. Odysseus, listening to a stranger sing about events he had lived through himself, began quietly to weep. The king noticed. He asked his guest why a song about a faraway war should make him cry. And so, finally, after years of hiding his name from strangers, Odysseus revealed who he was. He spent that long evening telling the Phaeacians the whole of his journey from Troy until that day. The Cyclops, the Bag of Winds, the Witch on the Forest Island, the Underworld, the Sirens, the Strait of Monsters, the Cattle of the Sun God, the 7 years with Calypso. The Phaeacians listened in astonished silence. The bard would later make a song of all of it, the very song we still have today. The Phaeacians, who knew a great story when they heard one, agreed at once to give Odysseus a ship and a crew to take him home. The next morning the Phaeacian sailors loaded their swiftest ship with gifts for the returning king, set him aboard, and sailed him across the last stretch of water between him and Ithaca. Odysseus, exhausted by his story and by everything that had preceded it, fell asleep on the ship's deck and slept the entire voyage. He had been awake, in one way or another, for 20 years. He had earned a deep sleep. The Phaeacians beached the ship on the shore of Ithaca at dawn. They lifted the sleeping king gently from the deck, laid him on the sand under a great olive tree, and piled all his gifts beside him. Then, without waking him, they sailed away. Poseidon, when he saw what had happened, was so annoyed that he turned the Phaeacian ship to stone on its way home, as a warning to anyone else who might think about helping his enemies. The peaceful kingdom of the Phaeacians never sailed again. Their hospitality had cost them. Sometimes doing the right thing is, unfortunately, also the most expensive thing. Odysseus woke on a beach he did not recognize. He had slept so deeply that, for the first few moments after he opened his eyes, he did not know what country he was in. He looked around. The shore looked vaguely familiar, but the morning mist was thick, and his mind, slowed by exhaustion and grief, did not quite trust what he was seeing. He thought, briefly, that the Phaeacians had betrayed him and abandoned him in some random place. Then a young shepherd appeared on the path above the beach. The shepherd asked him if he needed help. Odysseus, ever cautious about giving his real name and history to strangers, an old lesson he had learned with Polyphemus and had never quite forgotten, told a long made-up story about being a wandering merchant from Crete who had ended up shipwrecked in some unknown country. The shepherd listened patiently to the whole story and then, with a small smile, dropped the disguise. The shepherd was Athena. She had been waiting for him. The goddess greeted him with a kind of dry affection. She told him he had not changed. He was still spinning elaborate stories before he even bothered to ask where he was. Then she told him exactly where he was. He was home. The beach was Ithaca. The mist was just morning mist. The cliffs above the beach were the same cliffs he had grown up climbing. Odysseus, 20 years away from his country, knelt and kissed the soil. He wept. He did not weep for long, however, because Athena had work to discuss. The situation at the palace, Athena explained, was bad. 100 suitors had moved into his home. They were eating through his stores. They were courting his wife. They were planning to do worse than this. They were, in fact, plotting to deal harshly with his son Telemachus when the young prince returned from a trip he had taken in search of news of his father. Telemachus had sailed off to consult King Nestor at Pylos and King Menelaus at Sparta, hoping for word of Odysseus. The suitors had laid an ambush for him on his way home, intending to remove the only obstacle that stood between them and the throne. Odysseus could not simply walk into the palace and announce himself. The suitors outnumbered him 100 to 1. He needed surprise, he needed cleverness. He needed, above all, time to work out who in the household was still loyal and who had drifted to the suitor's side during his long absence. Athena had a plan. She would disguise him as an old beggar. She would change his clothes to rags, age his face by decades, dull his bright eyes, hunch his straight back. He would be, to anyone who looked at him, just another miserable old man wandering the countryside looking for a meal. In this form he could enter his own house without being recognized. He could observe, he could learn, he could plan, and when the moment was right, he could reveal himself. She touched him with her wand. Odysseus felt the changes ripple through his body. His skin became leathery and lined. His hair turned grey and thin. His shoulders drooped. His clothes, when he looked down, were the kind of patched and stained garments that beggars wore on the back roads. He looked, in short, like exactly the kind of person whom the suitors would treat with contempt, which was exactly the kind of person he wanted to be for the next few days. Athena nodded approvingly and told him where to go first. He should visit a certain hut in the country, where a faithful old swineherd named Eumaeus still tended the royal pigs. The swineherd would not recognize him in this disguise, but he would offer him hospitality, because that was the kind of man he was. Odysseus could rest there and gather information. The old beggar found his way to Eumaeus's hut on the wooded hillside above the bay. The swineherd was indeed the man Athena had described. Kind, careful, deeply loyal to his absent master, who he still spoke of as if Odysseus might walk through the door at any moment. He welcomed the strange beggar in, gave him bread and roasted meat, poured him wine. He did not recognize his old king. Odysseus, looking at this man he had not seen in 20 years, did not reveal himself. He listened to the swineherd talk about the kingdom, about the suitors, about the troubles at the palace, about his hopes for the young master Telemachus's safe return. The beggar nodded along. There is a particular quietness to listening to someone you love describe you in the third person, and Odysseus, perhaps for the first time in his life, sat quietly and let that quietness wash over him. Telemachus, meanwhile, was indeed sailing home from Sparta. He had received some encouragement on his trip. Menelaus had told him that Odysseus was, as far as anyone knew, alive and being held on an island somewhere. It had not been definite news, but it had been enough to give the young man courage. He had also been warned by Athena, through a dream, about the ambush waiting for him near Ithaca. He took a different route home, avoided the trap, and arrived safely on the far side of the island. Athena guided him directly to Eumaeus's hut. When Telemachus walked through the door of the swineherd's home, Eumaeus leapt up with such joy that he nearly knocked the table over. The old man embraced the prince like a returning son. The old beggar in the corner watched quietly. Eumaeus, eager to share the news, immediately ran off down the path to the palace to tell Penelope that her son had come home safely. The two men were left alone in the hut. What happened next was one of the great quiet moments in all of Greek literature. Odysseus and Telemachus, father and son who had not seen each other since Telemachus was a baby in his mother's arms, sat in the same room for the first time in 20 years. The father knew. The son did not. The father wanted to tell him. The father was also a man who had learned over a long career to be very careful about timing. After a few minutes, Athena slipped the disguise away. Odysseus, in his own true form, sat where the beggar had been. Telemachus stared. He did not at first recognize this stranger either, since he had never seen his father with his own eyes. But Odysseus identified himself, and after a moment of stunned silence, Telemachus understood. The two of them embraced. They wept together, the way two men weep when they have spent half their lives without each other for reasons that were never their fault. It was, of all the reunions in this long story, the quietest and perhaps the most moving. There were no monsters, no enemies, no battles, just a son finding the father he had been searching for his whole life, in a small wooden hut on a hillside above the sea. They had work to do. They had to plan how to handle the 100 suitors in the great hall of the palace. Telemachus was just one young man with a sword. Odysseus was a tired king who had been away too long. The two of them against 100 armed, healthy young men was not, on paper, a fight they should win. But Odysseus had spent his life winning fights he should not have won, and he had a plan. The plan was this. The next morning Odysseus would resume his beggar's disguise. He would walk down to the palace alone. Telemachus would follow shortly after, openly, as the returning prince. Inside the great hall, Telemachus would quietly remove almost all of the suitors' weapons from the rack where they had been hung as guests, leaving only enough for the two of them to use. He would lock the great doors of the hall when the moment came. Penelope, who would also not be told the truth at first, would propose a final contest to choose her new husband. The contest would involve Odysseus's old great bow, a weapon no one but Odysseus himself had ever been able to string. Whichever suitor could string the bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads lined up in a row would, Penelope would announce, become her husband and king of Ithaca. This was, Odysseus knew, a contest no one in that hall could possibly win except him. The suitors would try. They would fail. The bow would eventually come into the hands of the old beggar, and then, very quickly, the situation in the hall would change. The next day, the plan unfolded almost exactly as Odysseus had designed it. He arrived at the palace in his beggar's rags. The suitors mocked him, throwing food and small objects at him as he sat in a corner of the hall. Odysseus took it all silently, observing each of them, noting who was the worst and who occasionally showed a flicker of decency. There were a few of the latter, including one young man named Amphinomus, who actually offered the old beggar a kind word and a piece of bread. Odysseus quietly warned him to leave the palace before nightfall. The young man, who did not know why he was being warned, hesitated and stayed. The Greeks were fond of including such small moments in their stories, partly to remind the audience that the suitors were not all interchangeable, and partly to make the point that small acts of kindness do not always save us when we are caught in larger currents. Telemachus arrived later in the day, openly. The suitors greeted him with false warmth. The prince played his part, pretending not to notice anything unusual. Behind the scenes, with the help of 2 trusted servants, he began to move the weapons. Penelope, meanwhile, had been considering ending the long stalemate. The suitors had become unbearable. The shroud trick had run its course. She had been pressed for years to choose. That evening, watching her son move around the hall with a kind of restless energy she did not quite understand, she decided that the time had come. She brought out her husband's old great bow, set up the 12 axe heads in a line down the hall, and announced the contest to the assembled suitors. Whoever could string the bow and shoot an arrow through the 12 rings would be her husband. The suitors lined up. The strongest among them tried first. He could not even bend the bow far enough to slip the string into its notch. The bow was too stiff. The bow had been made for Odysseus's particular strength, and it had not been used in 20 years. Another suitor tried. He failed. They tried softening the bow with oil and warming it by the fire, like a stuck jar lid, which is one of those domestic touches the poets included because it grounded the scene in something everyone could picture. They tried passing the bow from man to man. The bow defeated every one of them. In the corner, the old beggar finally raised a hand and asked politely if he might try. The suitors laughed at the suggestion. An old beggar trying the bow that the strongest young men in the room could not bend? The very idea was ridiculous. They mocked him until Telemachus, who had been waiting for the right moment, raised his voice and insisted that the beggar be allowed to try. He was a guest of the household, Telemachus said. It would be a courtesy. What harm could it do? They handed Odysseus the bow. He took it. He turned it slowly in his hands, feeling the familiar grain of the wood. He tested its weight. He looked across the hall at his son, who was holding his sword loose at his side. He looked at his wife in the doorway, who could not understand why this strange old beggar was being given her husband's bow. And then, with a single smooth motion, Odysseus strung the bow as easily as another man would tie his sandal. He drew an arrow from the quiver beside him. He aimed down the long row of axe heads. He let the arrow fly. It passed through every one of the 12 rings in a single clean shot. The hall fell completely silent. The suitors, slow at first, began to understand that something was very wrong. The old beggar straightened up. His back was not bent at all. His shoulders, when he stood properly, were broad and strong. He looked at the suitors with a clear, hard, completely undisguised gaze. Athena, watching from above, let the disguise fall entirely. The suitors saw, for the first time, the face of the man whose house they had been occupying for years. What happened next has been illustrated in vases and paintings for nearly 3,000 years, and we will not dwell on the details. The doors of the hall were locked. The suitors found that their own weapons had been quietly removed earlier in the day. Odysseus had his bow, a full quiver, and Telemachus's sword in reserve. The faithful swineherd Eumaeus had also slipped into the hall at the critical moment with 2 more loyal servants. The reckoning, when it came, was short and decisive. The men who had eaten Odysseus's food and courted his wife and plotted against his son discovered very quickly that they had badly misjudged whose house they had been living in. By the time the dust settled, the great hall was finally clear of suitors. The kingdom of Ithaca had a king again. Odysseus stood in the quieted hall. He was breathing hard. He had not fought like this in 20 years. He was older than he had been at Troy. He was for a long moment simply tired in a way that had been building since the day he had first set sail. Penelope, who had heard the noise from her chamber upstairs, came down slowly. She had been told that her old husband had finally returned. She did not believe it. 20 years of hope and grief had made her cautious, almost stubbornly cautious, about believing good news. She had been disappointed too many times. She had been told he was dead, told he was alive, told he was coming, told he was lost. She had built a hard, quiet shell around herself, and she was not going to crack it open for a stranger, even one who looked very much like the man she had married. She came into the hall. She saw the man standing there. She looked at him for a long time without speaking. He looked back. Telemachus, who had been watching this reunion with the impatience of a young man who had imagined it differently, finally burst out in frustration that his mother was being impossible, that this was clearly his father, that anyone could see it. Penelope, the calmest person in the room, simply said that if this was indeed her husband, then they would have signs and secrets that only the 2 of them would know, and they would settle the matter privately. She then made what looked like a small practical request. She asked the servants to move her husband's bed out of their bedchamber and prepare it for the visitor in another room. Odysseus, hearing this, reacted exactly as Penelope had hoped he would. He frowned and demanded to know who had moved his bed. He said it sharply. He said it with the indignation of a man who had built that bed with his own hands. Because the bed in their bedchamber had not been built like any other bed in the world. It had been built around the trunk of a living olive tree which Odysseus had carefully shaped to be one of the bedposts, leaving the tree rooted in the ground beneath the floor. The bed could not be moved. It was, in a literal sense, part of the house itself. No one knew this except the 2 of them, and a single trusted maid who had been there when it was built. If a stranger had been pretending to be Odysseus, he could not possibly have known this. He would have agreed to have the bed moved. Penelope had set a test. The man before her had passed it. She crossed the hall to him. She put her arms around his neck. She wept into his shoulder. She told him that she had been so cautious because she had been frightened all those years, of being deceived by some clever impostor who would steal her last hope. She had needed a sign. He had given her one. He held her back. They did not let each other go for a long time. That night they slept in the bed that was rooted in the olive tree, in the house that was rooted in the island, in the kingdom that was finally rooted in its king again. Athena, watching from above, lengthened the night for them so that they had time to tell each other everything. 20 years, slowly, was poured into the space between them. Some of it was awful, some of it was funny, some of it was things that could not really be put into words at all. They had both lived enormous lives during their long separation. They were not quite the people they had been when he had left. They had to introduce themselves to each other, in a sense, all over again. But the foundation was still there, under both of them. They had remained themselves, deep down, even across 2 decades. Some things, the Greeks understood, were too well rooted to be moved. In the days that followed, Odysseus settled back into the work of being a king. He visited his old father Laertes in the countryside, where the 2 of them embraced in the orchard and made plans to live the rest of their years quietly. Laertes had grown so old in the long absence that Odysseus barely recognized him at first, and Laertes, who had been told too many false reports of his son's death over the years, was almost as cautious about believing the truth as Penelope had been. But the 2 of them sat together under the apple trees that the old man had planted long ago, and Odysseus described each tree by name, recalling which ones his father had given to him as a small boy, and the recognition came at last, and the orchard saw a second quiet reunion that summer. Odysseus also made peace with the families of the suitors, eventually with the help of Athena's careful diplomacy. He took up the work of running his kingdom again, the way a man might pick up a tool he had not used in 20 years and find that his hands still knew what to do with it. But there was one piece of business left. Tiresias, in the underworld, had told him that his journey was not entirely over until he had walked inland with an oar over his shoulder, walked until he reached a country where the people did not know what an oar was, until someone mistook it for a winnowing fan used to sift grain. There he was to plant the oar in the earth and make an offering to Poseidon in apology for everything that had passed. Only then would his wandering truly end. Odysseus did this. He took an oar from his ship one morning and began walking inland, away from the sea. He walked for a long time. He walked across the mountains of central Greece, into countries where the people had never seen the sea, into villages where children pointed at the strange wooden object on his shoulder and asked their parents what it was. Eventually, in some inland valley, a farmer working in his field looked up as Odysseus passed and called out cheerfully to ask why the stranger was carrying his winnowing fan to plant a crop. Odysseus smiled. He stopped walking. He planted the oar in the soil at the edge of the field. He made the offering to Poseidon that Tiresias had described. He turned and walked home. He lived, after that, the rest of his life on Ithaca, with Penelope at his side and Telemachus growing into the king he would one day become. He grew old. His hair turned white in the slow, ordinary way that human hair turns white. He sat under his fig tree in the afternoons and watched the light move across the bay. He told stories to his grandchildren about the war at Troy and the long road home. They did not always believe him. Some of the stories sounded too tall to be true, but he had brought home a few souvenirs over the years, a piece of the keel that had carried him across the wine-dark sea, an arrowhead from his bow, a scrap of cloth from Calypso's loom, and the children, who had not yet learned that the world is small, would touch these objects and feel something they could not quite name. When he eventually died in old age far from the sea, exactly as Tiresias had predicted, his death was so quiet that the household did not realize for some time that he had passed. He simply did not wake one morning. The longest and most twisting story in all of Greek myth ended the way the gentlest stories end, in sleep, in his own house, with his wife asleep beside him, and his son grown, and his kingdom at peace. And so we come, at last, to the end of the long night. We started in pure dark, in the silence of the first emptiness before anything existed, and we have walked all the way through it, past the rise of the gods, past the labours of a strong man tormented by his own divine stepmother, past a war that ended an entire age of the world, past a long sea voyage that became its own legend, past a quiet homecoming that turned out to be one of the most beloved endings in all of literature. We have heard from gods and goddesses, from heroes and villains, from prophets and witches, from sailors and shepherds and kings. What is striking about these stories, when you listen to them all together, is how human they are. The gods behave like enormous quarrelsome relatives. The heroes are flawed in recognizable ways. The wars are fought for reasons that turn out to be smaller than the wars themselves. The journeys take longer than expected. The homecomings are complicated. The reconciliations are imperfect but real. 3,000 years separate us from the people who first told these stories, and yet almost everything they wanted to say still lands. They were trying to make sense of why love hurts, why families break apart, why ambition costs so much, why the gods seem so often to be looking the other way when we need them most. They did not always reach satisfying answers, but they made beautiful stories out of the questions, and we have been telling those stories to each other ever since. The Greeks did not invent narrative, but they shaped it, in the centuries when these myths were being told around their evening fires, into something so durable that we're still drawing from the same well. Almost every story we tell each other in the modern world, every novel, every film, every long evening of one person telling another a story, has, in some part of it, the shadow of a Greek hero walking toward his fate, or a Greek god watching from a mountaintop, or a Greek wanderer trying to find his way home. The myths got under the skin of human storytelling so early that we cannot easily get them out. They are part of how we think now. When you describe someone as having an Achilles heel, when you call a long journey an odyssey, when you mention a Herculean task or a beauty that could launch 1,000 ships, or a chance to open a Pandora's box, you're speaking, without quite noticing it, in a language that is older than every language you actually speak. You have walked with us through the whole long arc of it tonight, from the silent dark before time, to Olympus, from the labours of a strong man, to the burning of a great city, from the song of the sirens to the olive tree bed at the centre of a quiet house. You have stayed with us a long time, and we're grateful for the company. There are not many things you can do for several hours these days that ask nothing of you except to listen, and we appreciate that you chose to spend yours with us. Now it is time to rest. The lamps are low, the story is told, the hero is home, the kingdom is at peace. 20 years of wandering are finally laid to rest under an olive tree bed in a quiet house above a quiet bay. Good night, traveller, sleep well, sweet dreams.